Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The Witch's House in Salem. I arrived in Salem with a sense of excitement and calm, the kind you get when you step off a bus and breathe in the fresh air of a new place. The streets were lined with old, weathered buildings, each one carrying the weight of history in its brick and mortar. My name's Evan, and I was here for a quiet vacation, far away from the noise of the city and the pressure of daily life. The town was exactly how I imagined, small, cozy, and full of charm. I was looking forward to visiting the museums, walking through the cobblestone streets, and maybe indulging in a few local ghost stories. Salem, after all, was famous for its witch trials and haunted past, but I wasn't the type to get spooked easily. As I checked into the small bed and breakfast, the elderly woman at the front desk gave me a warm smile, though her eyes seemed distant, as if she was lost in thought. "Enjoy your stay, dear. If you're curious about the local sights, there's plenty to see," she said, handing me a map. I smiled back and nodded, planning my days around the historical sites, not really paying attention to the odd little warnings that followed. "You should avoid the witch's house," she muttered under her breath, almost as if speaking to herself. "Why's that?" I asked, with a chuckle. "Oh, it's just a place full of old memories," she replied quickly, her eyes darting to the window as though something beyond it might be listening. "Nothing good happens there. But I suppose you wouldn't believe in such things." I laughed it off, thinking it was just another local superstition. Ghost stories and legends were part of the charm of Salem. But there was something about the way she said it, that fleeting moment of hesitation, that stuck with me as I left to explore the town. Later that evening, while walking through the town square, I overheard a group of tourists talking about the very same house. They mentioned it in passing, dismissing it as a place that had been abandoned for years. "A place where strange things happened," they said. I scoffed. "A haunted house?" It was clearly just a story to add to the town's colorful past. I had no intention of letting my imagination get carried away. I continued my stroll, the evening sky turning a deep shade of purple. The air felt crisp, almost electric, as if something in the town was waiting to be discovered. But, for now, I wasn't worried. I was here for a peaceful vacation, and I was going to enjoy it, rumors or not. The next morning, I set out to explore more of Salem. I had mapped out a few historical sites, the Witch Trials Memorial, a few old burial grounds, and a museum dedicated to the infamous events that had taken place here centuries ago. The town itself was charming, with its ancient buildings and quiet streets that seemed frozen in time. But as I walked from one site to another, a peculiar feeling began to settle in my chest, a vague sense that something was slightly off, like an itch I couldn't scratch. By mid-afternoon, I found myself walking along a quieter road, far from the tourist crowds. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but instead of retracing my steps, I decided to keep going. The road was lined with tall trees, their branches reaching high and tangled, casting long shadows on the ground. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and that's when I saw it. There, just beyond the trees, stood an old house, dilapidated, with broken windows and a roof that had seen better days. The paint had long since peeled away, and the wood was warped and gray. The house looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe even longer. But there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't just its appearance, it was the way it felt. Standing there on the edge of the road, I felt a strange pull, a sort of weight in the air that made my skin crawl. I wasn't the superstitious type, but something about this place made my heart race. It looked like a ruin, yet it felt like it was still alive, somehow. I walked closer, almost against my will. The air grew colder as I approached, and that's when I first heard it, whispers. Soft at first, barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves. But the closer I got to the house, the clearer it became. It was as if someone was speaking just beyond the reach of my hearing, their voices rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. I froze, listening intently, trying to make out the words. But it was impossible. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, swirling around me, making my pulse quicken. Shaking off the discomfort, I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, the creaking of the old house settling in the cool air. But something didn't feel right. The whispers felt deliberate, almost like they were trying to reach me, pulling me closer. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. Just the quiet stretch of road behind me. Taking a deep breath, I convinced myself to keep walking. I didn't need to be afraid of an old house. Salem was full of history, after all. But as I turned to leave, the whispering intensified, and for a brief moment, I could swear I heard my name. Evan. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the house was as silent as ever, its windows staring back at me like dark, empty eyes. I quickly walked away, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, a figment of my imagination. But even as I continued my tour of the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from that forsaken house on the outskirts of Salem. As the day went on, I couldn't get the house out of my mind. I tried to focus on the history of Salem, the witch trials, and the other famous landmarks, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that abandoned place. I couldn't shake the strange feeling it left me with, the whispers still echoing in my mind, faint but persistent. By evening, I found myself sitting at a small cafe, sipping coffee and flipping through a local guidebook. I'd intended to relax, but something kept pulling me back to the house. Maybe it was curiosity or the eerie atmosphere that clung to the place like a second skin. Whatever it was, I couldn't resist. I struck up a conversation with a woman sitting at the table next to mine. She looked like a local, older, with a weathered face that seemed to carry the weight of many years of history. I asked her if she knew anything about the house on the outskirts of town. Her eyes narrowed, and she lowered her voice, glancing around as though making sure no one was listening. "You mean the witch's house?" she asked. I nodded, feeling a strange thrill run through me. "Yes, that's the one. It looks abandoned. What's the story behind it?" Her face grew more serious, and for a moment, I wondered if I had asked the wrong question. She hesitated, then sighed deeply, almost as though she had been waiting for someone to ask. "The house belonged to a woman named Eliza Hawthorne," she began, her voice low and filled with a sense of gravity. "She was one of the last women accused of witchcraft here in Salem. But unlike the others, she wasn't executed. They couldn't prove anything, at least not in the way they wanted to. But the town still hated her." I leaned in closer, eager for more. The name Hawthorne sounded familiar. Wasn't there a famous author from Salem with the same last name? But I didn't interrupt her. I wanted to hear the story. "Eliza was different," she continued, her eyes drifting to the window. "She lived alone in that house, out on the edge of town. People say she was a healer, and she didn't follow the town's rules, especially when it came to their beliefs. She was strange, quiet, and never seemed to get older, no matter how many years went by. She had a reputation for making people disappear, though no one could ever prove it. Some believed she had the power to control people's minds, others thought she made deals with the devil himself. The woman paused, glancing at me, gauging my reaction. After the trials, the town wanted to forget about the past, but Eliza never did. She stayed in that house, and the rumors got worse. Some said they could hear her chanting at night, her voice floating through the air like an echo of something dark. Others spoke of strange lights coming from the windows when the moon was full. I swallowed hard. I had read about the witch trials, of course, but hearing about it in such detail, especially from someone who seemed to carry the weight of generations on her shoulders, made it all feel so much more real. Did she die there? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman gave a slow nod, her face darkening. Yes, but not in the way you think. They say she died alone, but her spirit never left the house. People still hear things, whispers, strange noises, footsteps when there's no one around. Some say she's still looking for souls to claim. Some say she trapped them inside her house, feeding on their fear. A shiver ran down my spine, and I looked down at my coffee cup, suddenly feeling as though the room had gotten colder. The house is cursed, she added, her voice growing softer. And anyone who dares to go inside, well, they don't come out the same. If they come out at all. I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. The whole town seemed to have its own take on the old stories, and the more I heard, the more real the house seemed. I thanked the woman for the information, though part of me wished I hadn't asked. As I left the cafe, the whispers of the witch seemed to follow me, an eerie reminder that in Salem, the past wasn't as dead as I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the witch's house. I could almost hear her voice calling to me, beckoning me back to that forsaken place. And though every logical part of me told me to stay away, a dark curiosity gnawed at me, urging me to see the house again, to discover the truth for myself. The next day, I found myself standing at the edge of town once more, staring down the narrow road that led to the witch's house. The warnings I'd heard echoed in my mind. You should avoid it, the elderly woman had said. Anyone who goes and doesn't come out the same. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt a pull, a curiosity that I couldn't shake. The house seemed like an enigma, something I had to understand. I knew I should ignore it, continue with my vacation, and forget the strange stories and whispers. But there was something about that place. The way the house loomed on the horizon, hidden behind the overgrown trees, its broken windows staring at me like empty eyes, made me feel like it was calling me. I had to see it for myself. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows grew longer, I decided to go. The road was quiet, no one in sight, and I felt strangely alone, even though I was in the middle of a town that thrived on its history. The last few houses I passed looked abandoned, their windows dark, like no one had lived in them for years. The air was thick, not quite cold but far from warm, as though the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I reached the old house as dusk began to settle over the town. The trees around it seemed to sway in the wind, their bare branches creaking, and the house itself looked even more desolate than before. The front porch was sagging, the stairs half-rotted, but there was a strange allure to it. I had to know what lay inside. I stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning under my weight. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to move forward. The door was ajar, barely hanging on its hinges as though it hadn't been touched in years. I pushed it open, the hinges squealing like a dying animal. The smell that hit me was musty, damp, the smell of something forgotten and decaying. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The sudden noise made my heart skip a beat. For a moment, I froze, but I quickly convinced myself it was just the wind. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying sun filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Dust swirled in the air, making it hard to breathe. The walls, once white, were now stained with the passage of time, peeling paint and fading wallpaper. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of life here, no sounds of animals or birds outside, just the eerie stillness that seemed to seep into everything. I stepped further inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. I called out, but I wasn't sure why. "Hello?" My voice sounded odd in the silence, and I instantly regretted breaking it. Nothing answered. I moved through the rooms one by one, each one darker than the last. The furniture was old, covered in sheets, and everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. The house felt like it was frozen in time, a relic of something long past. The faint scent of something burning lingered in the air, but I couldn't place it. Then I heard it. A soft sound, like the rustling of fabric, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there, motionless, listening. The sound came again, a faint shuffle, as though someone was walking slowly above me. I could feel a tightness in my chest, an uncomfortable pressure, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I was scared. I couldn't deny it. But I couldn't turn back either. Not yet. The stairs creaked as I slowly ascended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The upstairs was even darker, the air thick with the weight of years gone by. I didn't want to go any further, but I couldn't stop myself. The whispers, the strange feeling that had followed me since I first saw the house, were growing louder in my ears. My pulse quickened, and my feet carried me down the narrow hallway. At the end of the hall, I saw a door slightly ajar. I couldn't see what was behind it, but something in me knew that I needed to open it. Something was waiting inside. I reached for the handle. The house seemed to hold its breath. And then, just as I was about to push it open, the door slammed shut. A sharp, deafening sound, like thunder in the dead silence of the house. My heart raced, my breath caught in my throat. The door stood there, closed tight, mocking me with its unyielding resistance. I turned quickly to leave, my instinct screaming at me to get out, but as I spun on my heel, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, pacing behind me. The house was alive. I couldn't tell if the footsteps were real or if they were simply in my head, but either way, they were getting closer. And I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, as the door slammed shut behind me. The sound reverberated through the house, filling the air with a deep, resonant thud that felt like it was coming from the very walls themselves. The air grew colder instantly, a biting chill creeping under my skin. I turned, my breath shallow, to look at the door, half expecting it to open again, to let me escape. But the door didn't budge. The house was now locked in an unnatural silence, broken only by the soft thudding of my pulse in my ears. It was the kind of silence that made the air feel thick, heavy with something unseen. The creaking of the house seemed to stop, the wind outside muffled, as if the house was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. The door, once barely hanging open, was now completely shut. The windows, too, were covered with old boards, casting the entire place into shadow. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, but my mind was a mess. I had to leave. I shouldn't have come here. But I couldn't move. A strange presence filled the room, something that wasn't just a feeling but a weight in the air. It felt like the house was watching me, like something, or someone, was waiting just beyond my vision. I took a step forward, then another, but my feet felt heavier with every move, as though the floor was somehow trying to hold me in place. I thought I heard breathing. Soft, almost imperceptible at first. It was so faint, I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination playing tricks. But then, I heard it again, closer this time, like a low, rasping breath coming from behind me. I froze, my body stiff with fear. Turning slowly, I scanned the room, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, decaying furniture and the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I tried to rationalize it. It was just my nerves, nothing more. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I had to leave. I was being ridiculous. I could find my way out. I just needed to calm down. I turned back toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard it, clear and unmistakable. A whisper. Evan. It was my name. Soft, like a breeze, but with a weight that made my heart stop. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. The voice seemed to come from every corner of the room, surrounding me, pressing on me from all sides. I felt a coldness wrap around my chest, a tight, suffocating grip that made it hard to breathe. I spun around, frantic now, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Only the empty house, its oppressive silence settling back over me. Another whisper, this time louder. Come closer. I stepped back, my foot catching on something. I stumbled and fell, hitting the floor hard. My breath came in short gasps as I pushed myself up, my hands trembling. The presence in the room was thick, as though it was pressing on me from all directions, suffocating me with its intensity. I backed away, scrambling to my feet, desperate to get away, but the footsteps I had heard earlier were back, closer this time, unmistakable and deliberate. They were slow, each step echoing through the house, getting louder with every passing second. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere near me. It was coming from the very walls themselves, moving behind me, surrounding me. I spun around again, but there was nothing. No one. But the footsteps were there, too close now, as though the house itself had come alive with the sound of movement. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It was as if the entire place had a presence, a force that I couldn't understand, but that was undeniably real. I turned to face the door again, my body moving before I could think. There was no choice now. I had to get out. I slammed my hands against the door, my panic rising, but it wouldn't budge. It was like it was part of the house now, its hinges locked by some unseen force, holding me inside. And then the whispering started again, only this time, it was different. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus of voices. Soft, whispering, but unmistakably there. Stay with us, Evan. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air thickening with an almost tangible pressure. I could feel it against my skin, crawling under my clothes, tightening around my throat, suffocating me. My eyes darted from corner to corner, looking for an escape, but there was no way out. The house. No, it wasn't just a house. It was something else. Something alive. And then, amidst the whispering, I felt it, a touch. Cold and clammy, like fingers brushing against my back. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except for the oppressive presence that surrounded me, that clung to the air itself. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't going to be able to leave. Not now. Not ever. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my lungs struggling to fill with air as I stood in the dark, oppressive room. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a subtle, unsettling rhythm that I couldn't quite place. My heart was still racing, but I had to stay calm. I had to push forward. I couldn't let this place defeat me. The whispers still clung to the air, faint but persistent, as though they were just beyond my comprehension. It felt like I was surrounded by something unseen, something waiting, but I couldn't afford to let my mind wander too far. I couldn't let fear take hold. Not here, not now. I glanced around the room again. The furniture was all old, dusty, faded, and abandoned. Chairs were turned away from the walls, as though they had been left in a hurry, and a large, ornate mirror hung crookedly on one wall, its surface cracked and streaked with grime. The curtains were torn, sagging from their rods, their fabric eaten away by years of neglect. I stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking beneath my weight. Each step felt heavier, as though the house itself was pulling me deeper inside. The chill in the air was undeniable now, seeping into my bones, making my skin crawl. My breath came out in small puffs, visible in the still, stagnant air. But still, I tried to brush it off. It was just an old house, after all. A house that had been abandoned for years. The dust, the cold, these things were natural, right? Nothing supernatural about it. At least, that's what I told myself. I walked further into the room, my shoes crunching over the dust. The furniture was shrouded in old white sheets, and the occasional hint of something dark and stained peeked out from beneath. A couch in one corner, its cushions sagging, an old armchair by the window, its wooden frame warped with age. A small wooden table stood against one wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust, with a single chair pushed up to it as if someone had been waiting there, waiting for me. A shiver ran down my spine at the thought, but I forced myself to dismiss it. It was just an old house. Nothing more. I moved toward the table and examined it, trying to distract myself from the sense of unease that clung to my skin. There were faded books stacked in the corner, their pages yellowed with age, and a small porcelain figurine, chipped and broken, sat at the edge of the table. Everything in the room was a reminder of something that had been left behind, forgotten in time. But then, I noticed something strange. The air felt thicker here. Heavier. The chill was more pronounced, biting at my exposed skin as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. I instinctively pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't seem to help. The cold settled into the room, freezing my thoughts and making it difficult to breathe. It was almost as though something in the room had suddenly shifted, like I had crossed some invisible threshold. I turned around quickly, glancing at the door. It was still closed, the dark hallway outside stretching into the unknown, beckoning me further. The house seemed to loom over me, its silence deafening. But there was something in the air now, something subtle, but insistent. A presence, not like before. This was different. I felt eyes on me, watching me from the shadows, though I couldn't say how I knew. It wasn't logical. It didn't make sense. But I felt it. A faint whisper brushed against my ear, soft as the wind. Stay. My pulse quickened, and I immediately took a step back. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the voice I had heard earlier. This was more intimate, personal. It felt like it came from right behind me, as though someone was standing there, just out of my line of sight. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. The room was empty. I stood there for a moment, my breath quickening as the shadows of the room stretched longer, darker. I fought the urge to turn and run. I had come this far. I couldn't let fear dictate my every move. I had to keep exploring. I had to know what was really going on here. I reached for the next room, opening the door slowly. The creaking sound echoed through the house, as if every inch of the place groaned with the effort of allowing me inside. The room was even darker than the last, and the smell of mildew hit me like a physical force. As I stepped inside, my foot brushed something cold and smooth. I looked down and saw a thin, dust-covered object on the floor. I knelt down to pick it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I wiped the dust away. It was a small, tarnished locket. The chain was broken, but the metal still held a faint gleam beneath the grime. It was beautiful, delicate. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. I opened it, expecting to find a picture or some kind of token, but instead, the inside was empty. Just a cold, hollow space, devoid of any trace of the past. For a moment, it felt like the locket was waiting for something. Waiting for me to place something inside. A chill crept up my spine as I stood, my fingers clutching the locket tightly. I had the distinct sense that I was not alone in the house anymore. Whatever had been watching me, whatever presence lingered here, was growing stronger. The house was responding to me. And I wasn't sure if that was something I should be afraid of, or something I should embrace. Either way, I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I stood still for a moment, the locket still clenched in my hand. The air around me felt unnaturally cold, like a draft that couldn't be traced to any open window. The house seemed to sigh, creaking with its old bones as if it were alive, watching me. I glanced around the room, desperate to shake off the feeling that something was creeping just beneath the surface of reality. It wasn't long before something else caught my eye. The walls of the room, once covered in faded wallpaper, had patches where the paper had peeled away. Underneath, I could see something strange. There were symbols, scratch marks, etched deeply into the wood. They weren't random gouges, like the marks of age or wear. No, these were deliberate, carefully carved into the grain of the wood as if someone had painstakingly etched them by hand. I moved closer, feeling a wave of unease wash over me as I crouched down to get a better look. The markings were unlike anything I had ever seen. Some were simple lines, others were curved, swirling patterns that twisted into shapes I couldn't quite understand. Each one seemed to bleed into the next, as if they were part of some larger design, some intricate language written in the very bones of the house. I traced one of the symbols with my finger, a jagged line that intersected a series of circles. It was cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding wood, and I quickly pulled my hand away. I couldn't tell if the chill was from the old house or if the symbols themselves exuded something unnatural. A strange feeling gnawed at me, like I was trespassing in a place I wasn't meant to be. This wasn't just graffiti. This wasn't something left by careless hands. Whoever had done this, if they were even human, had done it with purpose. The carvings seemed to hold an unsettling energy, as if they were part of something far larger than the house itself. I stood up slowly, feeling my pulse quicken. I had to understand what these symbols meant. They couldn't just be random, could they? I turned, seeking something, anything, that could offer an explanation. but the room offered no answers. I stepped back into the hallway, where the dim light from the window barely lit the path ahead. The whispers were back again, faint but persistent. They were like a hum in the background, never quite loud enough to make out words, but always there, pulling at my attention. I moved further down the hall, drawn to the source of the strange carvings. The farther I went, the more I noticed them, on every wall, on the ceiling, hidden beneath layers of dust and decay. They were everywhere, like a language woven into the very fabric of the house. Some seemed familiar, like they had been from an ancient text I've read once, though I couldn't quite recall where. Others were completely foreign, their shapes and meanings lost to time. I knelt in front of one of the markings, a series of interlocking triangles, trying to decipher it. My fingers hovered just above the etchings, the coldness of the wood sending a shiver up my spine. "What is this?" I whispered aloud to no one. It didn't seem like a language from any culture I knew. It felt older, darker. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Salem, witches, strange markings. It was as if the house itself was trying to tell me something important. Something that might explain why I felt so uneasy in its presence. But I couldn't make sense of it. Not yet. I pulled my phone from my pocket, intending to search for some explanation. Maybe there was something on the internet about ancient symbols or hidden messages in Salem. I could try to make sense of it all. But just as I unlocked the phone, the room grew colder, the air thickening around me. My breath clouded in front of my face, and the chill felt like ice against my skin. Then I heard it again. A whisper, but this time it was louder, more insistent. "Leave." The word was clear, almost a command. It sounded like it was right behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the shadows stretching across the room, the faint glow of daylight filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I swallowed hard. The voice was different now. It wasn't the soft, distant murmurs from before. This was sharp, urgent. And it made my heart skip a beat. "Leave," it repeated, closer this time. I spun around, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But the silence followed, heavier than ever. My mind raced, my breath quickening. The chill was unbearable now, numbing my fingers as I fumbled with the phone in my hand. I glanced at the screen, desperate for anything to calm my nerves, but the signal was gone. No bars. No Wi-Fi. Panic surged through me. The phone dropped from my hand, crashing to the floor, but I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on something I hadn't seen before. A figure. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the shadows, there was something standing. It was tall, thin, and the air around it seemed to distort, like a mirage. The figure was draped in tattered robes, its face hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its gaze. It was watching me. It had always been watching me. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Vanished. The room was empty again, except for me and the markings. I stumbled back, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, or thought I had seen. Was it a trick of the light? My mind playing games with me? But I knew it wasn't. Whatever that figure was, it was real. And it was tied to the house, to the markings, to the whispers. Something was awake in this place. And I was beginning to realize it wasn't something I could outrun. I stood frozen in place, the echo of the whispered words still hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. "Leave," it had said. The voice was gone now, but its weight lingered, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. I had seen something. A figure, a presence in the corner. But was it real? Or had I imagined it, my senses playing tricks on me in the dark? I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. It was just the house. Just an old, abandoned house. I had been in places like this before, had read about them in books, heard the stories from other travelers. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet, the stale air that played with my mind. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. My gaze darted around the room, catching every shadow, every movement. I couldn't help it. I had to look over my shoulder, even though I knew no one would be there. Still, I couldn't shake the whispers. Soft, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, barely audible, but unmistakable. They were coming from somewhere, everywhere. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The hallway behind me was empty. The dark corners where the light couldn't quite reach, the spots where the shadows clung tighter, felt like they were closing in, but there was no one. Nothing. I stood motionless for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, forcing myself to remain calm. But my nerves were beginning to fray. There was something about the house, something about this place that made everything feel wrong. I stepped back into the room, my footsteps heavier than usual, the floor creaking under my weight as though it was protesting my intrusion. The air was thick now, almost suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the faint scratches on the wood almost seeming to grow before my eyes, twisting, contorting, as though the house itself was alive, breathing with me. I had to get out. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me deeper, like an invisible force tethering me to this place. I had to know what it was. I had to understand. Another whisper broke the silence, this one softer, but somehow more distinct. Turn around. I did. Instantly. My eyes shot to the doorway behind me, but again, there was nothing. Just the empty hall. The soft gleam of daylight barely filtering through the boarded-up windows, the silence suffocating. I swallowed hard, but my throat felt dry, constricted. My pulse was racing now, a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of my neck. It was just my mind, I told myself. Just the isolation. But that wasn't enough to quell the anxiety rising in my chest, clawing at my ribs. The whispers were louder now, like a cacophony, swirling in the air, beckoning me deeper into the house. I could hear them, just faintly, over the sound of my heartbeat. Stay with us. They murmured. Don't go. My hands trembled at my sides. I clutched the locket again, its cold surface grounding me momentarily, but it did little to stop the rising tide of panic in my chest. My legs were heavy, like I was moving through water, and I had to drag myself forward, past the strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers were becoming more insistent, louder, like they were coming from all around me. I glanced around wildly, trying to find their source, but the room remained as empty as it had been before. The air felt suffocating, as if something was closing in on me from all directions. My breathing grew shallow, rapid. My thoughts scrambled, trying to make sense of the madness creeping into my mind. I stumbled toward the next room, my feet unsteady, my head spinning. The door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping into the dim light of the next room. It was just as silent as the last, save for the whispers that now echoed off the walls, louder, more demanding. My eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for something, anything that would make sense of the madness that was unfolding before me. But there was nothing. Just empty space. Just the shadows. And yet, the whispers persisted. "You're not alone." I froze. I could hear it, clear as day. The voice was right beside me, almost in my ear, cold and breathless. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but once again, there was no one there. No figure. No presence. Just the same hollow silence. I leaned against the wall, my back pressed to the cold wood. The whispers were getting worse, their intensity rising until they were no longer whispers at all. They were voices, voices that filled the room, that filled my mind. "You should have left. It's too late now." I staggered back, a scream clawing its way up my throat, but it was swallowed by the voices that surrounded me. They were everywhere. I was surrounded, but no one was there. There was nothing tangible, just the voices, swirling, filling the air with dread. "Don't leave us." The room felt like it was closing in on me. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker, stretching toward me like they were alive. My skin tingled, my heart racing as if it were about to burst. My hands shook violently, but I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The voices faded into a low hum, like the buzzing of insects, but the weight of their presence remained, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I had to leave. I had to get out. But the house had its grip on me now. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to escape the pull. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices, trying to convince myself that this was all in my head. But when I opened them again, the whispers were louder than ever. And I knew then. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. I stumbled into the next room, my mind still reeling from the oppressive whispers that had surrounded me. The walls seemed to press in on me from all sides, and I couldn't escape the sense that I was being watched. Each step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening, choking me with its weight. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that might offer some comfort, some explanation for what was happening. The room was sparsely furnished, its features simple but worn, just like the rest of the house. But then something caught my eye, a glint in the dim light. A mirror. It stood in the far corner, framed in ornate, tarnished gold. Its surface was smudged with dust, the glass faintly reflecting the dying light from the boarded-up windows. I couldn't help but be drawn to it, as if it were calling me. The moment I turned toward it, I felt a strange pull, like something deep inside me was being beckoned closer. With trembling hands, I stepped forward. The whispers in the air had faded, leaving only the dull hum of silence, but I could still feel the tension building, coiling like a snake, just waiting to strike. I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. My face was pale, drawn with the stress and fear of the last few minutes. The shadows in the room were long and stretched across the floor, but I looked normal. Just me, standing in front of the mirror. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then, something caught my eye. Behind me. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. Just the empty, dust-covered room. I swallowed, shaking off the unease. I was imagining things. It was just my mind, playing tricks on me, I thought. But when I glanced back at the mirror, the reflection was off. It was subtle at first, a shift that wasn't quite right. My reflection remained the same, but something was different. The shadows in the room seemed to move, but they shouldn't have. The air was still, the room was still, yet the reflection in the mirror showed something, someone. Something was standing behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around again, but once again, there was no one there. The room was empty, silent, save for the oppressive weight of the air around me. I turned back to the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure was still there, just behind me in the reflection, its form barely discernible, like a shifting shadow, but unmistakably present. I stared at it, frozen in place, too terrified to move. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and a dark, indistinct face. I couldn't make out any features, but the sense of dread that radiated from it was suffocating. The figure shifted closer, like it was slowly moving toward me, but my body refused to move an inch. It was as if the reflection had a life of its own, something that didn't belong in this world. I could feel my breath catch, my chest tightening with the growing realization that this wasn't normal. This wasn't some reflection in a mirror, it was something else. Something alive. And it was watching me. The figure reached toward me, its hand, long and bony, stretching out from behind my own reflection. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink, as if I were trapped in the mirror itself. The hand hovered just behind my shoulder, its cold fingers inches away from my skin. I gasped, stumbling back, but when I moved, the figure didn't follow. It remained frozen in place behind me, its hand still reaching for me, as if it couldn't cross the boundary of the glass. The reflection was now distorted, the figure's form rippling like it was submerged in water. It was warping, stretching in unnatural ways, as though it were made of smoke or mist. My own reflection was contorting too, twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. My face elongated, my mouth stretched wide in a silent scream that didn't come from me, but from the mirror itself. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room felt colder, and I shivered violently. The air seemed to grow dense, thick with the smell of something old, rotten, like mold, as though the house itself was decaying around me. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, sharper. "You're not alone," they said. "You never were." I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The room was the same, but my reflection was not. My hands shook as I reached toward the mirror, hoping to somehow break the connection, break free from the grip the house had on me. But as my fingers touched the glass, I felt the ice-cold chill of the surface against my skin. The reflection rippled under my touch, but it wasn't just the glass. It felt wrong, like something was moving beneath the surface, something alive. The whispers grew louder, the voices now overlapping, all speaking at once. They were like a chorus of angry, desperate souls, their words unrecognizable, their meaning lost in the noise. The reflection in the mirror began to twist, reshaping itself into a monstrous form, a figure that looked nothing like me anymore. The thing behind me in the reflection was no longer just a shadow. It was something more, something with sharp, jagged features and glowing eyes that pierced through the glass. It was smiling, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. And then, in a voice that cut through the madness of the moment, the thing in the mirror spoke. "Stay with us, forever." I stumbled backward, knocking into the wall behind me. My breath was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The mirror's reflection remained the same, but the room around me was shifting, warping, as if the boundaries between reality and the mirror were dissolving. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house. But as I turned to run, I realized with a sickening certainty that the house itself wasn't going to let me go. I bolted toward the door, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. The whispers in the room had grown into a maddening cacophony, filling the air with an unbearable pressure, as though the very walls were closing in on me. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling violently as I grasped it, but when I twisted, it didn't budge. I pulled harder, a surge of panic rushing through me. The door wouldn't open. It couldn't be locked. I'd seen it before. It was just a wooden door, old and creaky, like the rest of the house. But now it felt immovable, as if it had fused to the frame. I threw myself against it, pushing with all my strength, but the door didn't give. Something was wrong. My breath quickened as I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of the situation. The house had never felt this way before. The walls, the floor, even the air, it was all pressing in on me, squeezing the life out of me. The whispers were getting louder again, swirling around me like a storm, each voice pulling me in a different direction, each one demanding I stay. "Leave us," one whispered. "Stay," another cried. "You can't leave," a third voice hummed, cold and mocking. I turned, my gaze frantic, trying to find any escape. But the room, no, the entire house, was shifting. The space around me felt fluid, like it wasn't quite real. The corners of the room seemed to warp and distort, as if I were trapped inside some twisted reflection of reality. The house, this house, was alive. It was shifting, changing, and I was a part of it now. I tried the door again, desperate. I pushed, pulled, shoved with all my might, but it was useless. It was like the house had become a living thing, a giant, suffocating organism, and I was caught in its grip. I was trapped. Sweat trickled down my forehead as my breaths grew more and more erratic. The silence between the whispers was unbearable. It was like the house was waiting for something, watching me, waiting for me to break. The floor beneath my feet creaked ominously, the sound almost like a low growl, as if it too were warning me. I turned toward the window, hoping to escape through there, but the glass was dark and covered with thick grime. I couldn't even see outside. All I could see were the reflections of the room behind me. No light. No freedom. Just shadows, stretching like long fingers, reaching out to pull me back in. I rushed to the window and pounded my fists against it, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't move. I hit it harder, again and again, until my hands ached, but nothing. The glass remained unyielding, as if it were an impenetrable barrier. The house was mocking me, toying with me. I stepped back, my head spinning, my thoughts a blur of panic. I had to get out. I had to. But the house was playing a cruel game, trapping me, ensnaring me in its twisted web. The whispers were back, louder now, more frantic. I could hear them so clearly, as if they were inside my head, their voices overlapping, drowning out everything else. "Stay. Stay with us forever. You can never leave. You're ours now." I staggered back, my legs weak, my mind spinning. The shadows were pressing closer, the room narrowing, the air growing thick and heavy, like it was trying to suffocate me. I could feel the walls closing in, could hear them creaking, groaning under the pressure. The house was breathing, alive, and I was caught in its grasp. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't even hear myself over the madness of the whispers. I was trapped in a nightmare that wasn't ending. I turned, my eyes darting around the room in panic. There was nothing. Nothing but the suffocating silence, the oppressive shadows, and the growing sense that the house was becoming a part of me. A reflection of my fear. And then, something worse happened. The door creaked open. but it wasn't the way it should have been. No slow release, no freeing motion. It was as if the house itself had decided to let me go, but in a way that felt far worse than being trapped. The door opened wide, and I stood there, frozen in place. Beyond it, the hallway stretched out, dark and endless. It was the same hallway I had walked through earlier. The one that had felt like it led nowhere. The air in the hallway was cold, a draft pulling at my skin, and I could feel the weight of it, like it was calling me. A dark, oppressive force. The house was alive, I realized. And it wasn't just trapping me, it was trying to drag me deeper into itself, into something darker. I stood at the threshold, trembling, my pulse erratic. The whispers were now a chorus, loud and overwhelming, but I couldn't make out the words. I couldn't hear anything except that voice that had been with me all along, echoing through my mind. Come, it beckoned. I stepped forward, my feet heavy, unwilling. But I couldn't stop. My body moved without my consent, dragged by the same force that had been pulling me all this time. I was caught in its grip, caught in the house's suffocating embrace. And as I walked deeper into the hallway, I knew with chilling certainty that I was never going to leave. The house had claimed me. Forever. The door slammed shut behind me, and the darkness of the hallway swallowed me whole. I stood frozen for a moment, the silence pressing in like a physical force, suffocating me with its weight. The whispers had faded, but their presence still lingered in the air, like the remnants of a haunting melody I couldn't quite shake. The house seemed to breathe around me, its walls creaking and groaning, as if it were alive, watching me, waiting for me to move. I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady, my mind spinning. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened, the mirror, the figure, the whispers. Everything felt so wrong. Nothing in this house was as it should be. Nothing was real. Not anymore. As I walked down the corridor, my mind kept drifting back to the stories the locals had told me about the house, about the witch. I had dismissed them as nothing more than the typical ghost stories that towns like Salem were known for. But now, standing here in the darkness, with the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to those tales. The witch. She was the one who had lived in this house, so the stories went. A woman who had once been feared by the townspeople for her strange powers, her unnatural connection to the forces of the unknown. Some said she had been a healer, using herbs and potions to cure the sick. Others said she had been a sorceress, dabbling in dark magic, summoning creatures from the depths of the earth to do her bidding. There were whispers of rituals performed under the light of the full moon, of people vanishing from the town, never to be seen again. The one story that had always stuck with me, though, was the one the old woman at the market had told me. She had been so serious, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if the very act of speaking it might summon something terrible. The witch didn't die, she had said. Not really. She's still here, in the house. She's waiting, watching, waiting for someone to come and let her out. At the time, I had thought it was just a tale spun by someone too deep into the town's superstitions. But now, as I moved deeper into the house, every step felt heavier, every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning, and I couldn't help but wonder if those old stories had been true. The witch's power, the magic she had supposedly wielded, had she left it behind? Was that what was keeping me here? The house had already shown me it was far more than just an old, abandoned building. It was a prison built with the witch's dark magic, designed to keep people trapped, to keep them in its grasp. I thought back to the mirror, to the reflection that had twisted and contorted before me, to the figure that had reached for me. I had felt its presence, its cold, unnatural energy, as if something had crossed the line between the real world and the world of shadows. I could still feel the chill in my bones, the sense that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. Could the witch still be here, in this house, alive in some twisted way? Was she the one controlling it all, using the house as her vessel, her prison, to trap the souls of anyone who ventured inside? I had no answers, just questions, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might never get the answers I was seeking. The house had a way of twisting the truth, of warping reality into something that no longer made sense. I had to get out of here. But as the thought crossed my mind, I heard it again, the whisper. "You can't leave." It was a soft voice, almost a sigh, but it carried with it a weight that made my skin crawl. I turned, looking around the hallway, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, to grow darker, stretching toward me like long, black fingers. The air felt colder, and the temperature dropped noticeably, as if the house itself was feeding off my fear, drawing it in, growing stronger. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The whispering stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, in the distance, I heard a door creak open. It was soft, like the house was teasing me, leading me further in. I had no choice but to follow. Something, or someone, was guiding me deeper into the house. And with every step, I felt myself slipping further from reality. I couldn't tell if it was the house or my mind that was unraveling, but either way, I knew I was no longer in control. The witch's power, whatever it was real. I could feel it now, in the air, in the walls, in the very ground beneath my feet. It was all around me, pulling me in, drawing me closer to whatever fate awaited me here. The house had claimed me, and the witch, it seemed, was the one holding the leash. The house felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of cold air, every shadow in the corner, everything seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if the house itself had a mind of its own. The walls groaned under the weight of something unseen, something ancient. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, not truly. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere, it was the way the house seemed to move around me, always shifting just beyond the corner of my eye. I had to get out. I pushed forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence, each step a reminder that I was moving deeper into the house, further away from any chance of escape. The hallway stretched on, endless, as if the house was growing, expanding in ways I couldn't understand. The door I had come through was gone now, vanished, like it had never existed. I reached for the walls, running my fingers along the cold, peeling wallpaper, my breath shallow and quick. The house was toying with me, bending reality on itself, warping the space around me like some grotesque reflection of the outside world. I turned a corner, my heart racing, and immediately stopped. In the distance, I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the doorway of the room ahead. My breath caught in my throat. There was something there, I was sure of it. But when I stepped closer, the doorway was empty, nothing but dust and cobwebs waiting for me. My eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner, every shadow. Nothing. I couldn't trust my eyes anymore. The house was playing tricks on me. I stumbled backwards, my mind racing. I had to find a way out. I had to escape this madness, this suffocating presence that seemed to be all around me. The walls were closing in, the air thick with the scent of decay. The house was alive, and it was suffocating me. Every corner seemed to hide something just out of sight. Every shadow seemed to shift, every noise a whisper, a breath, a movement. The house was alive, and it was aware of me. It was watching me. It was waiting for me to slip up, to falter, to make a mistake. I could feel its eyes on me. No, not eyes. Eyes weren't the right word. The house didn't need eyes to see me. It felt me. It knew my every movement, my every thought. I moved forward, my steps more cautious now, as if the floor beneath me might suddenly give way. The walls seemed to bend closer, the ceilings lower, the air growing thicker. The house was breathing with me, matching my every move, every breath. I could hear its pulse, deep within the wood, in the creaking beams and shifting floorboards. It wasn't a structure anymore. It was a living thing, and I was trapped inside it. My hand brushed against the doorframe as I reached the next room, and a sudden chill ran through me. It felt as though the house was drawing the heat from my body, like it was feeding off my fear, drawing strength from my desperation. I spun around, searching the room for any sign of a way out, but the door, the only exit, had vanished. Again. This was impossible. The air was suffocating, and I was dizzy with the pressure closing in on me. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally long, curling at the edges like claws reaching out to drag me into the dark. I couldn't trust anything. Nothing here was real. Nothing was what it seemed. The house had no limits, no boundaries. It didn't obey the rules of the world I knew. And I was just a pawn, caught in its game. I had to think. I had to find something, anything, that could help me escape this nightmare. My eyes darted to the window, and for a moment, I thought I saw light beyond it. The faintest glow of the outside world, so distant, so unreachable. But when I rushed to it, my heart leaping with hope, the glass was dark again, black as night. The outside world, the world I had come from, was gone. There was only this place. And it was hungry. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. My legs were weak, my body trembling with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in. The house would not win. It couldn't. I had to find a way out, even if it meant tearing this place apart brick by brick. I turned down another hallway, my breath ragged, and saw a door at the end. It was different, new. I was sure it hadn't been there before. A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. A way out. This was it. I could feel it. But as I moved toward it, the whispering began again. Soft at first, just a murmur, but growing louder with every step I took. Not yet, it breathed. You're not ready. I froze. The door was getting further away. No matter how fast I moved, it stayed at the same distance. It was impossible. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending corridor with no exit. The air grew colder. The shadows stretched longer. I was back where I started. The house was toying with me, drawing me deeper, pulling me into its heart. It was alive, and it had no intention of letting me leave. Not until it had drained every last ounce of my strength, of my sanity. It was feeding off me, feeding off my fear. I was just a piece in its puzzle, and the more I struggled, the tighter the walls pressed in. I was running out of time. The whispers grew louder. At first, they had been soft, faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. But now, they were unmistakable, an ever-present sound that wrapped itself around my mind like a noose. Every step I took echoed with the voices, growing in intensity, as if they were closing in, surrounding me. I tried to block them out, but it was impossible. The more I tried to focus on the house, on finding a way out, the louder they became. Not yet. Stay with us. They're watching you. The words slithered through the air, soft and insidious, twisting around my thoughts. I couldn't make sense of them. Each phrase felt like a command, a warning, a threat. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did no good. The voices only grew louder, more urgent, more desperate. I stumbled through the hallways, my mind spinning, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the relentless whispers that echoed in my skull. The walls around me seemed to pulse with each word, as if the house itself were speaking to me, feeding me its dark thoughts. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I whipped my head around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. The kind of shifting darkness you only see in places like this, old, abandoned houses where the light never quite reaches the corners. But it wasn't my imagination. I saw it again. A fleeting shadow, too fast to catch, but unmistakable. It darted across the hallway, just at the edge of my vision. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place. I turned, trying to track it, but as soon as I looked, it was gone. A trick of the light? Or something more? The uncertainty gnawed at me, gnawed at my sanity, until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I pushed forward, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just losing my mind. But the further I moved into the house, the harder it became to convince myself. The shadows were getting more frequent, more tangible. They weren't just flickers now, they were full figures, moving just beyond my line of sight, slipping in and out of the darkness like smoke. Tall and slender. Silent. Watching. I turned down another hallway, my legs heavy, my head spinning. And there it was again, a figure. It stood at the far end of the corridor, just out of the reach of the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form stretching and twisting as if it were made of shadows itself. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, a coldness that gnawed at my bones. Leave me alone, I muttered to myself, more to steady my nerves than to speak to whatever was out there. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I forced myself to take another step. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care what I was leaving behind. All that mattered was getting away from the thing that lurked in the house. I raced down the hallway, my footsteps loud against the silent walls, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if urging me to turn around, to look back. Come back, they hissed. It's waiting for you. I ignored them, not daring to glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It followed me down the hallway, pressing against my back, breathing down my neck. I rounded another corner, and this time I didn't see a shadow. Instead, I heard a soft rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across the floor. It was coming from the room ahead, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The door creaked open, and I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. Something inside me, something dark, something that didn't belong to me, compelled me to move forward. I pushed the door open slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. Not now. Not while I was so close. Inside the room, the shadows moved. Not like before, this time, they weren't just fleeting glimpses. The shadows twisted and writhed, stretching across the walls like living things. They slithered across the floor, the ceiling, dancing in the flickering light from the broken windows. They were alive, and they were waiting for me. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat, but the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, my heart racing, but the walls of the room were shifting, closing in on me. The shadows, those dark shapes, began to converge. "They're coming," the whispers said. "They're coming for you." And suddenly, the door to the room wasn't there anymore. It had vanished, just like every other way out. The room was now completely sealed, no way forward, no way back. The walls themselves seemed to close in, pressing against me, the air thick with an oppressive heat. The shadows moved faster now, their forms solidifying, becoming something human. Figures, tall and thin, their faces distorted, featureless, just dark outlines of what they once might have been. They surrounded me, and I could feel their presence like a weight on my chest. "You are not alone," the whispers murmured. "You belong here now." The shadows reached out toward me, their fingers long and thin, brushing against my skin like ice. My body went cold, and my legs trembled beneath me, but I couldn't move. The air thickened, the house closing around me, and the shadows pressed in tighter. They were here, and they were not letting me go. I stumbled backward, my pulse pounding in my ears as I struggled to shake off the feeling of the shadows closing in. But then, in the corner of my vision, I saw something new, something different. A door. It was at the far end of the room, tucked away behind a stack of old furniture. I didn't know how I had missed it before. Perhaps the house had hidden it from me, or maybe it had just appeared, as everything else had. But there it was, the faintest sliver of light bleeding through the cracks around its edges. I rushed toward it, nearly tripping over my own feet as I pushed open the door, half expecting it to vanish behind me like every other escape. But this time, the door stayed open. A dim, flickering light spilled out from the room beyond, casting strange shadows across the floor. I stepped into the room, and immediately, the air felt different. It was thick with dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years, but there was something else, something ancient, lingering in the air. The room was filled with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with old, leather-bound books. Strange glass bottles and jars lined the shelves as well, their contents a murky mix of liquids, powders, and bones. The smell of herbs and something sharp filled the air. It felt like a place of forgotten magic, a place where time had ceased to matter. As I walked deeper into the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me again. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift and sway, like they were alive, observing my every move. But there was no turning back. I had come this far. Then, something caught my eye. A book. At first, it seemed like any other, worn and weathered with age. But as I drew closer, I realized that this one was different. It was glowing faintly, a soft, eerie light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. The glow was not bright, but it was enough to make it stand out among the other dark, forgotten tomes. I reached out for it, my fingers trembling. As soon as I touched the cover, the light grew stronger, flickering like a candle caught in a draft. My hand felt icy, as though the book itself was drawing the warmth from my skin. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should put it back. But then the whispering began again, louder this time, more insistent. "Take it," they whispered. "It's yours." I couldn't explain why, but I knew that I had to open it. The compulsion was too strong to ignore. Slowly, carefully, I opened the cover, the pages creaking under my touch. The book was filled with symbols I didn't recognize, twisted markings that seemed to shift as I looked at them. The ink on the pages looked fresh, almost as if it had been written recently. I skimmed through the pages, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening to me, to the house, to the whispers that followed me. Then I found it. A drawing, crudely sketched but unmistakable. It was a figure, tall and cloaked, standing in the center of a circle of strange symbols. I could feel the chill in the room grow colder as my eyes traced the lines of the figure. It was the witch. The witch who had once lived here. The book detailed her powers, her ability to trap souls, to feed off the fear of those who wandered into her domain. It spoke of how she had bound herself to the house, a vessel for her dark magic, so that even in death, her presence could never leave. The house had been built as a prison for her, a place where she could lure the curious, the lost, and the brave, only to trap them forever. The pages began to flicker again, and my breath caught in my throat as the words shifted before my eyes. The symbols began to move, rearranging themselves in a pattern I recognized, a pattern I had seen in the walls of the house, in the shadows that clung to every corner. The witch's mark. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. The glow faded instantly, but the weight of what I had just read sank deep into my chest. I had found the source of the power. The witch was still here, her presence bound to the very walls of the house. And now, I was part of her world. There was no escape. The shadows shifted again, gathering around me, pressing in closer. I could feel them, curling around my body, tugging at my limbs, as if they were pulling me toward the center of the room, toward the circle on the page. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. "You are here," they chanted. "You are hers." I backed away, my body trembling with fear. I tried to run, to throw the book down, to escape, but the shadows followed me, blocking every path. They were everywhere now, circling, closing in, their dark forms no longer just shadows, they were real, tangible, alive. The book had opened a door, but now that it was open, there was no closing it. The witch's power was waking, and there was no way to stop it. The walls began to close in again, and I realized, with horrifying clarity, that the house was no longer just trapping me, it was feeding. The witch was feeding. On me. On my fear. And I was about to become another soul lost in her web. As my fingers brushed the pages of the book, a sudden, bone-chilling cold rushed over me. It swept through the room like a wave, a freezing gust that seemed to come from nowhere. My breath came out in clouds, the air around me growing impossibly colder with each passing second. I shuddered involuntarily, my skin prickling as if the very air had turned to ice. The house responded. It wasn't just the cold that changed. The walls seemed to shift, groaning and creaking as if they had come to life. I could hear the timber of the house straining under some unseen pressure, the wood twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the ground itself had started to buckle, shifting as though trying to rearrange itself. I looked up, trying to find the source of the sudden chill, but the room was the same. The shelves were still lined with dusty bottles and jars, the dim light still flickering in the corners. But everything felt wrong. The shadows in the room seemed to darken, deepening in intensity until they began to crawl along the walls, creeping toward me. The whispers started again, but this time they were louder, more urgent. "Close it. Don't read it. Leave, now." The words seemed to reverberate in the air around me, like echoes bouncing off the walls, growing louder with every passing second. I snapped the book shut, desperate to stop the madness, but it was too late. The house seemed to pulse in response, as if the very walls were alive, reacting to my actions. The door behind me slammed shut, the sound of it echoing through the room like thunder. The faint light from the window flickered out, plunging me into near total darkness. I could hear something, no, someone, moving in the dark. The very air felt thick with presence, as if invisible hands were reaching out, touching me, but not in any way I could comprehend. I wasn't alone. A sudden crash from above startled me, and I whipped around, my heart racing in my chest. The noise echoed through the house, rattling the walls. It came from the upper floors, the same place where the shadows had been thickest. I felt it, something had stirred, something awake. I took a step back, but the air grew thicker, heavier, like invisible fingers were grasping at my chest, squeezing tighter with every breath. My eyes darted to the walls, the shelves, the furniture, as if expecting something to jump out at me at any moment. The whispers had changed. They were no longer just voices. Now, they sounded like screams, distant but desperate, full of anguish and terror. The sounds were becoming clearer, as if they were right beside me. My hand shook as I reached for the door, my heart hammering. I grasped the handle, locked. I yanked at it, pulling with all my strength, but it didn't budge. The shadows around me seemed to grow, crawling up the walls and across the floor like living creatures, slithering toward me, toward the book. The witch's presence was undeniable now. I could feel her power in the air, thick and suffocating. The house was no longer just a place, it was a prison, an extension of her cursed will. The walls seemed to close in tighter, as though the house itself was breathing, hungry, watching, waiting. I was trapped. The book in my hands began to vibrate slightly, a low hum that I could feel in my bones. The cold grew colder, sharp and biting. The walls creaked louder, as though the house itself were shifting in preparation. The witch's power was awakening, and I was no longer just a visitor, I was intruder. A prey. Suddenly, I heard something behind me, a soft, dragging noise, like something heavy was moving across the floor. Slowly, I turned, my body trembling, to find myself face to face with a figure. A shadow, tall and formless, standing just beyond the flickering light. It was watching me, unmoving. And then, in the dimness, I saw something, a face. Or rather, a reflection of a face, twisted and warped in the darkness, its eyes hollow and empty, staring at me with a deep, insatiable hunger. It moved closer. I backed away, clutching the book to my chest as if it were some kind of shield. The whispers grew louder still, like the house was breathing down my neck. I could hear the voices now, clear and harsh, not the distant murmurs, but something inside me. The house was in my head, filling me with its darkness, its pain. Leave, before it's too late, the voice seemed to say, but it wasn't one of the whispers, it was the witch's voice. Her voice. The shadows surrounded me, reaching for me with cold, grasping fingers. I could feel the weight of the house closing in on me, suffocating me. And I realized, too late, that I had made the worst possible choice. The book had opened the door to something that couldn't be closed. And now I was part of it. Part of the witch's curse. I tried one last time to escape, but the shadows were too strong, pulling me deeper into the house's grip. The walls began to close in, and I felt my legs give way beneath me, my body frozen in fear. I was no longer in control. The house had me, and I had just sealed my fate. I couldn't tell how long I had been in that house. The minutes, hours, maybe even days, seemed to blur together, as if time itself had lost all meaning here. The house had changed. It was no longer just a decaying building, it was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that wrapped around me, tightening its grip with every breath I took. The walls were closing in. At first, it had been subtle. The air had felt heavy, as though I was breathing underwater. But now, the pressure was unbearable. The walls creaked and groaned, shifting inward with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I could hear them, see them, shifting, warping, like they were alive, stretching toward me. I staggered forward, my hands outstretched to steady myself, but the house seemed to push back. The floorboards beneath me shifted, groaning as if they too were trying to keep me from moving, as if they were part of the trap that had been set for me. My feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, each step heavier than the last. The house was trying to swallow me whole. I tried to run, but every direction led to the same place, nothing. The halls twisted in impossible angles, as though the house was mocking me, shifting and rearranging itself with a mind of its own. The once dim light flickered, casting long, menacing shadows that danced across the walls, making it impossible to tell where I had been or where I was going. The whispers were louder now. They didn't come from the walls anymore, or the shadows. They came from inside me, voices, distorted and hollow, filling my mind with confusion. I couldn't trust my own thoughts. The house had infiltrated my mind, and with each passing moment, I was losing my sense of reality. I tried to take a breath, but the air was thick with something wrong. It didn't feel like air at all. It felt like the house itself was breathing, each exhale pressing in on me, tightening around my chest. I coughed, my throat dry, but it did nothing to ease the feeling of suffocation. Was it getting smaller in here? I glanced around, my head spinning. The walls were definitely closer. I could see them now, their rough wooden surfaces seeming to pulse, as if they were closing in on me with every heartbeat. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the wall. It felt wrong. The wood was warm, as though it were alive, breathing under my touch. I jerked my hand back, heart racing. The house was watching me. It knew me. I tried to push past the growing panic. I had to focus. I had to think. There had to be a way out. I couldn't let the witch. No, I couldn't think like that, I told myself. I wasn't going to be swallowed by this cursed place. Not yet. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing, the sound bouncing off the walls, disorienting me. I was still on the ground floor, I was sure of it. I had to be. But everything around me felt distorted, wrong. The rooms twisted and bent at unnatural angles, like the very fabric of space itself was being torn apart. And then it happened. I reached a doorway, the familiar, wooden frame standing before me like a lifeline. A way out. I could see the hallway beyond, a long stretch of dimly lit passageway. I stepped forward, but as I did, the door shuddered. The air shifted again, and I realized the hallway was no longer the same. It had changed. The once familiar walls now felt alien, their surfaces warped and covered in strange symbols that had not been there before. I tried to turn back, but the room behind me was gone. The hallway, the door, the walls, everything had shifted, like the house had swallowed it all. It was as if time itself had been reset, as if the house had rewritten the space around me. The walls were tightening. The house was shrinking. I could feel the pressure on my chest intensifying as the walls moved closer, inch by inch. Every sound was distorted now, every creak of wood louder than the last, until they all blended together into a deafening roar. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Get out! I turned in every direction, desperately trying to find an escape, but the house was closing in faster than I could move. My breath came in short gasps, and panic rose like a wave inside me. I couldn't think straight. The walls were too close. The shadows were too thick. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but I knew no one would hear me. I was alone. Alone in this nightmare. The whispers returned, louder than ever, this time not as distant voices, but as a chorus, all around me, swirling, suffocating. Too late. You're already hers. I stumbled back, tripping over something in the dark, something that didn't belong. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, alive beneath my hands, as if the house itself had given birth to something else. The walls groaned louder, the house rattling as if some ancient force was awakening. The pressure around me felt unbearable, crushing. I looked up, only to find the ceiling lowering, the beams coming down to meet me, trapping me beneath their weight. The house had closed in. The trap had tightened. And I realized, in that moment, that there was no way out. The walls, the house, the witch, they had already won. I opened my mouth to scream, to let out the panic that gripped me, but nothing came. My lungs burned, my throat tightened, and I could feel the desperate pressure rising inside me, but no sound broke free. My mouth was open, my chest heaving with the effort, yet it was as if the very air had been sucked from the room. The house had stolen my voice. I staggered back, my hand clutching at my throat, gasping for air that seemed to vanish before I could catch it. I felt a cold, wet sensation at the back of my neck, as though something invisible was brushing against my skin, but when I turned, there was nothing. The shadows stretched and swayed unnaturally, pressing on me from all sides. I tried again, scream, but it was as if my body had forgotten how to make a sound. My mouth moved in desperation, but the air around me seemed to absorb it, sucking in every cry, every plea, until it was nothing more than a hollow, suffocating silence. I could still hear the whispers, but now they were louder, more insistent, their voices twisted and garbled, speaking over each other, like a dozen souls trapped within the same space. Silence, forever. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the wall again, hoping to find some kind of stability. But the house moved with me. The wood seemed to ripple under my touch, shifting and squirming like a living thing, as if it knew what I was trying to do. My fingers slipped from its surface, and I pulled back in horror as the floor beneath me shifted, tilting slightly as though the very ground was trying to throw me off balance. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't shout. I could only hear the sound of my own thoughts swirling faster and faster in my mind, pushing me to the brink of madness. There was no escape. The walls were still closing in, drawing near with every second, but it was more than that. The silence had taken hold of me, swallowed my screams before they could even reach the air. The house was muffling me, suffocating me, trapping me not just physically, but in a way I couldn't explain. The whispers grew, swirling in a chaotic chorus that tore at my sanity. Some were words, others just gibberish, fragments of voices from long-forgotten souls, but all of them seemed to push against me, to drown out any resistance. I tried to move, to find a way out, but my legs were weak, my mind reeling from the oppressive silence that threatened to crush me under its weight. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was everything, the way the house had pressed in on me, how it knew how to twist the air, the space, the very way I moved through it. I felt the walls breathe with me, the air around me thick with the sense that something was lurking just beyond my perception, watching, waiting. The shadows were closer now, but I couldn't see them, not fully. I could only feel them tugging at the edges of my vision, growing darker, creeping forward like they were trying to pull me into their depths. The house had me. It was meeting me, taking away the one thing that might have given me the strength to fight. My voice. My sound. My escape. The walls groaned louder now, as though the house was alive and aware of my struggle. Every creak, every moan from the timber felt like it was directed at me, a mocking reminder that I was trapped here, locked in with the whispers and the suffocating silence. I was powerless. I could feel my body shaking, my nerves fraying at the edges as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to hold on to something real, something tangible. But all I had was the silence. And the house. And the witch. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself, but the world spun violently as I opened them again. The shadows were closer now, their forms sharper, more distinct. A figure loomed just out of reach, its shape hazy at first, but slowly becoming clearer. It was humanoid, tall, its face obscured by the shifting shadows, but there was something familiar about it. Something wrong. I backed away, but my feet didn't move fast enough. The figure took a step toward me, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't hear my own breath, but I could feel it, each frantic beat of my pulse echoing in my ears. The shadows stretched forward, elongating, bending around me like they were alive, reaching for me. The house was alive. The figure took another step, and I tried again to scream, but the silence swallowed it. The house seemed to laugh at my helplessness, its walls shifting again, this time pulling in tighter, closing around me like a trap. I was nothing but a prisoner in its grip, lost in its endless silence. And then I felt it, cold fingers brushing against my face. The witch was here. I could feel the presence before I saw her. It was a cold sensation that prickled along my skin, a creeping chill that spread through my veins like ice. The air grew heavier, thicker with an unnatural weight that made it difficult to breathe. It wasn't just the suffocating silence or the pressing walls anymore, there was something else. Something alive. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and there she was. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow that seemed to hover at the edge of the hallway, stretching unnaturally in the dim light. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its silhouette blurred, as though the darkness itself was clinging to it. A twisted outline of a woman, long limbs that didn't seem to fit with the rest of her form, like they were too elongated, too wrong. And then, it began to move. Her body shifted, bending in unnatural ways, the limbs twisting and stretching with a sickening crack as she glided closer. I tried to back away, but my feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body betrayed me, rooted in place by an invisible force. My legs were heavy, my muscles stiff, as if the house itself were pulling me deeper into its dark embrace. Her face, if you could call it a face, was obscured by a dark veil of hair that hung like a tangled mass, wild and disheveled. But there were eyes that pierced through the darkness with an unnatural glow. They were wide, empty pools of black, glowing faintly, burning through the gloom. The whispers in my head grew louder, faster, swirling around me in a maddening cacophony. They were her whispers, the witch's voice carried through the fabric of time and space, weaving through my thoughts like poison. The words were nonsensical, but they sounded like they came from somewhere far beyond the house, somewhere ancient, like the earth itself had a voice. You should not have come here. Her voice wasn't like any voice I'd ever heard before. It was soft, melodic, but it carried a weight that pressed down on my chest, stealing my breath away. It was as if the sound itself was suffocating, wrapped in layers of malice and sorrow. I tried to speak, tried to ask who she was, but the words stuck in my throat. My mouth opened, but I could no longer force a sound from it. The silence had taken that from me, too. She took a step forward, and I felt the temperature drop even further. The cold seeped into my bones like ice water flooding my veins. Her form blurred again, flickering like a broken reflection in a mirror. I could see her. No, I couldn't. Her shape shifting, distorting, her limbs elongating, stretching out of proportion as if the very fabric of her being was unraveling before me. It was grotesque, inhuman. My vision swam with dizziness, and I reached out to steady myself, my hand pressing against the wall. The cold from her reached me, and for a moment, I thought I might freeze from the inside out. My skin was burning with the cold, and my heartbeat thudded painfully in my chest. "She sees you." The voice was no longer in my head. It was in the air, surrounding me. The whispers grew, echoing off the walls, coming from every direction, twisting and distorting with every syllable. They were the words of the witch, the words of her. I tried to take a step back, but my legs were still frozen, my body trapped in this hellish moment. Then she spoke again, her voice growing louder, clearer. "You're mine now." The words sliced through me like a razor. Her figure lurched forward, her head jerking to an unnatural angle. I could see her mouth now, wide and gaping, stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth like those of an animal, no longer human. The smile that split her face was not one of malice or mockery, it was something worse. It was the smile of something hungry. She was feeding on my fear. I could feel it in every fiber of my being, a gnawing, hollow emptiness spreading through me, consuming everything. My breath quickened, my vision blurred, and my pulse raced. My body wanted to flee, but it refused to obey. I could only stare, helpless, as the witch's distorted figure loomed ever closer, her shape flickering like an old film reel, fading in and out of focus. The walls shifted again, but this time I wasn't sure if it was the house or my mind that was bending. The witch's form stretched forward, as though the hallway itself was trying to fold in on her, trapping me within her reach. She was everywhere now, her presence suffocating, filling every space, every crack, every shadow. My body was shaking, my eyes wide, as the world around me turned darker, colder. Her figure grew larger, more monstrous, with every blink of my eyes. The house was warping around her, like it was feeding on her presence, responding to her every move. And then, with a sudden jerk, the figure lunged. Her hand, no longer a hand, but a claw, shot out toward me, her fingers long and skeletal, with skin stretched tight over bone. It reached for me, and I felt the coldness of its touch just before I could react. But I couldn't escape. I was trapped. The witch had me. Her hand grasped my arm with a force I couldn't escape. The coldness was unbearable, sending a jolt through my body as though ice had replaced my blood. Her fingers tightened around my wrist, the bones in her hand creaking like dry branches under pressure. I tried to pull away, to fight, but my body refused to respond. The strength she wielded was something beyond human, beyond anything I had ever encountered. I couldn't move. She drew me closer, her presence overwhelming, a weight pressing down on me from all sides. The shadows around her flickered and twisted, dark tendrils reaching for me like hungry hands, tugging at the edges of my vision. The air thickened with the stench of decay, like something long dead had been left to rot in the walls. And then she spoke. The words came in a language I couldn't understand. They were words, really, they were sounds, low and guttural, like a chant, like something ancient and vile. The syllables reverberated through the space, each one twisting the air, each one digging deeper into my mind. Her voice was liquid, smooth, and honeyed, but there was an undercurrent to it, a dark, insidious undercurrent that rattled through my skull. It was as though every sound she made was bending the air around us, distorting it, suffocating it, and pulling at something deep inside me. I tried to break free from her grip, to focus on something, anything that might help me regain control, but my body was paralyzed, locked in place as though I were caught in the grip of some invisible force. Her words swirled around me, a torrent of unintelligible sounds that seemed to fill every corner of the house, echoing off the walls and pressing in on me from all sides. With every syllable, I felt her power growing stronger. She was reaching into me, past my skin, past my muscles, past my thoughts. I could feel her presence inside my chest, in my very bones. It was as though her voice had dug deep into my soul, tethering me to her, threading her influence through the marrow of my bones. It was an invasion, complete and total, no longer just her physical form looming over me, but her presence wrapping itself around me like chains, squeezing, tightening, suffocating. The words came faster now, more insistent, the rhythm of them changing, building in intensity. My heart pounded louder in my ears, a frantic drumbeat in time with her voice, but I couldn't escape. The more I fought against it, the more her grip seemed to tighten, until it was as if the very house was closing in, the air growing heavier, more oppressive, pressing on me from every direction. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, those dark pools of black, and I knew then that she wasn't just speaking to me. She was commanding me. I was losing myself in her power, piece by piece. My thoughts became muddled, my sense of self slipping away like water running through my fingers. It wasn't just fear that I was feeling anymore, it was something deeper, something more primal. Obedience. Her voice echoed the word, even though she hadn't spoken it aloud. It wasn't something she said, it was something she imposed, a dark force settling over my mind, bending me to her will. And I was powerless to resist. I could feel the struggle, the last remnants of my will fighting against the pull, but it was like swimming in quicksand. No matter how hard I tried to move, I sank deeper into her control. My mind screamed, but my body betrayed me, my muscles no longer obeying my commands. I was nothing but a vessel for her power, a puppet tangled in the strings of her dark language. Her fingers tightened around my wrist once more, and I gasped as the air around us thickened, as though the house itself was feeding on her words. "You are mine," she whispered, the phrase slithering through my mind, taking root deep in the darkest corners of my soul. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tear away from her grasp, but I couldn't. My body wasn't mine anymore. She had claimed me. Her grip tightened again, and I could feel something shift in the air, something like a pulse, like the heartbeat of the house itself. The floor beneath my feet seemed to vibrate in time with it, the walls creaking, groaning, as if the house itself were coming alive, responding to her command. Her voice grew more intense, louder now, and as it did, I felt the pull within me grow stronger. It wasn't just her words anymore. It was her will, her very presence, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket, drowning out everything else. And then, with a final, unyielding surge of power, she let go. I collapsed to the floor, my limbs trembling as though I had been drained of everything. I could feel my breath returning, shallow and ragged, but the air was still thick with her presence, still heavy with the weight of her words. I was no longer certain of who I was. The witch had taken more than just my voice. She had taken my very will. I had crossed a line I couldn't return from. The cold lingered, curling around my limbs like tendrils of ice, as if the house itself had wrapped its suffocating grip around me. I could still feel her presence, the witch, coiling deeper inside me with every passing second. I fought against it, my hands trembling as I reached for the wall, pushing myself to stand. Every fiber of my body screamed to escape, but something told me that I might not be able to. I couldn't just stand here, trapped in this nightmare. I had to get out. The window. I stumbled toward the far corner of the room, my feet dragging behind me, a dull ache in my muscles as though the house itself was trying to keep me in place. It wasn't just my body that was weakening. It was everything. The air felt thick and oppressive, the walls breathing in time with me, like a living thing watching, waiting for me to make my move. The window in the corner was old, its glass cloudy, cracked in places, as though it hadn't been touched in years. But it was the only way out. I reached for the heavy, rusted frame, my fingers sliding over the dust-coated sill. The cold from the outside air seemed to call to me, promising escape. But as soon as I grasped the edge of the window, something inside the house shifted. The wood creaked beneath my touch, a low rumble reverberating through the room. I yanked at the window with all my strength. The glass groaned, but didn't budge. It was as though the house itself was holding it in place, keeping me inside. And then, the air changed. I felt it, a subtle pressure, a shift in the atmosphere, like the house was exhaling. The walls seemed to move, contracting in on themselves, making the space feel smaller, more suffocating. The temperature plummeted, and the cold became unbearable. My breath formed thick, white clouds in the air, the chill sinking into my bones. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from the night, it was the kind of cold that seeps into your soul, freezing everything in its path. I stepped back, trying to assess the situation. I had to get out. I had no other choice. But as I looked at the window again, I noticed something wrong. The glass no longer looked like ordinary glass. It had turned black, swirling with veins of dark shadow, pulsing like it was alive. I reached out to touch it again, but before I could, the house reacted. The room trembled. A deep, guttural sound resonated from the walls, like a growl, low and vibrating, threatening. I felt it in my chest, vibrating through my bones. The air crackled, as if the house itself was warning me to stay away. Suddenly, the window rattled violently, as though an unseen force had slammed into it from the outside. The glass shook, splintered, and with a deafening screech, it cracked. But it wasn't like ordinary glass breaking. The shards splintered, but they didn't fall. They stayed suspended in the air, floating, hanging there like shards of frozen lightning. The broken pieces shimmered with an eerie, unnatural glow, the edges sharp and jagged. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest. My hands trembled at my sides as I realized that the house wasn't just old. It was alive. Alive in ways I couldn't understand. I stepped toward the door, my mind frantically searching for another way out. I tried to rationalize, to calm myself. There has to be a way. But the whispers, those maddening whispers, filled the room once more. I could hear her voice again, low and sweet, coiling around my thoughts. You cannot leave. The words dripped like poison into my mind, seeping into my very consciousness. The weight of them bore down on me, and I realized with sudden clarity, the house wasn't just a building, it was a prison. And I was its prisoner. My heart raced, a panic building within me. I turned toward the door, but it didn't open. I yanked at the handle, desperately trying to push it open, but it resisted. It was locked. No, not locked, sealed. The house had sealed me in, trapping me in its grip. It didn't want me to leave. It needed me. Or perhaps it was the witch, weaving her curse through every crack in the house, tightening the walls around me. The room was shrinking, the walls pushing in closer. I could feel the pressure growing, my chest tightening as though the air itself was being sucked out of the room. The whispers in my mind grew louder, like a crescendo of voices swirling together into a single chorus. You are mine. I screamed, my voice lost in the suffocating silence of the house. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, the floor beneath me groaning, shifting, alive with some dark, unseen force. I could feel it, the witch's presence, her power wrapping tighter around me, choking the air from my lungs. I was trapped in her world, in her domain. The house had become a living thing, a twisted extension of her will. And the more I struggled, the tighter the trap became. The window, the door, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. I was never going to leave. I couldn't breathe. The suffocating air around me, thick with the witch's presence, pressed down on my chest like a vice. The walls of the house seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding in rhythm with the frantic beating of my heart. Every step I took, every move I made, felt like I was sinking deeper into a trap that was as ancient as the house itself. I had to find a way out. The thought was a single, burning thread that kept me going, even as every corner of the house seemed to close in on me. There had to be something, a door, a window, an escape of some kind. I couldn't stay here. I refused to. It felt like I'd been searching for hours, though time had become a strange, warped thing in this place. It could have been days, or only minutes. It didn't matter anymore. But then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I found it. A door. It stood at the far end of the hallway, tucked away behind a curtain of shadows. The frame was worn, its wood weathered with age, but it looked solid, untouched by the decay that had claimed so much of the house. It stood alone, quiet, almost waiting for me. For a moment, I hesitated. The house had tricked me before, showing me things that were what they seemed. But desperation pushed me forward, and before I could second-guess myself, I reached for the handle. The door opened easily, almost too easily. I stepped through, a rush of cold air greeting me as the house seemed to release its grip on me. The smell of earth and fresh air hit my nostrils, and for the first time since I entered, I felt a sense of hope. I was outside. I was free. Or so I thought. I turned around, expecting to see the house behind me, looming in the distance, its dark windows staring back at me. But what I saw instead sent a chill through my veins. I was still inside. The walls were the same, rotting wood, dark shadows creeping along the edges of the room. The floor beneath me creaked as I took a step forward, my feet sinking into the familiar, warped wood. The air felt just as thick as it had been moments ago. The silence was deafening, pressing in from all sides. The door was still open, standing wide with the same faint light spilling through, but it led nowhere. I turned around again, expecting the outside world to greet me, trees, the sky, the open air. But all that met my eyes was the same hallway I had been trapped in for what felt like an eternity. I stumbled backward, my mind racing as the familiar sense of dread crept over me once more. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time, I felt something far worse than fear. I felt hopelessness. The house had shifted again. The door I had stepped through was no longer a portal to the outside. It had become another lie, another illusion. A trick. It was as though the house was alive, adapting to my every movement, warping reality itself to keep me trapped. I pressed my hand to my forehead, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my mind. I had to make sense of this. There had to be a reason. There had to be a way out. But the more I thought, the more the house seemed to mock me, pulling me deeper into its web. I walked toward the door again, trying to force myself through. My heart raced and my hands trembled. I had to escape. But as I reached the threshold, the moment I touched the handle, the world around me seemed to blur, to twist, as if I was being pulled back into the very essence of the house itself. The coldness returned, heavier this time. The shadows closed in tighter, suffocating the air. The whispers began again, not from the walls, not from the corners of the room, but from everywhere. It was as if the house was speaking to me, mocking me, its words seeping into my mind. You are mine. You will never leave. The door slammed shut before I could make another move, and the world around me shattered. I was back inside, back in the heart of the house, standing in the same hallway, the same room. The door, the outside, had all been an illusion. It wasn't real. I turned in circles, my breath quickening, panic rising in my throat. It couldn't be happening. I couldn't have fallen for it again. This house, this cursed thing, had taken my every hope and crushed it beneath its weight. It had played with me, lured me out, only to pull me back in. I collapsed against the wall, my legs giving way beneath me. My mind screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and terror. I had walked through the door, and it had taken me nowhere. There was no way out. The witch's power was complete. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, thicker than before, heavier with each breath I took. The house, now a labyrinth of twisted halls and rooms, felt alive. Every corner I turned, every step I took, the air seemed to thicken with a malevolent energy. I couldn't explain it. Each moment felt as though the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to break, to lose myself within its shifting walls. I had just stepped through the door, a door that led nowhere, but it felt as if I had never left the house at all. Nothing had changed. The walls were the same as before, cracked, rotting, and cloaked in shadows. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet with every step, like a warning. There were no windows here. No sign of the outside world. It was as if the house had swallowed me whole. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to clear the dizziness creeping over me. Maybe I was just disoriented. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I had been inside for so long, days, maybe? The air was stale, suffocating. I couldn't be sure of anything anymore. The house seemed to mock me, shifting just beyond my grasp. I turned back toward the door, the one I had come through only moments before. I wanted to try again. I had to. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But as I reached for the handle, I noticed something. The door, which had been wide open just a moment ago, was now shut tight. I pushed on it, but it didn't budge. My heart skipped a beat, panic creeping into my chest. I stepped back, breathing hard. The air felt different now, thicker, like it had been soaked with something invisible. And the walls, they weren't the same. I could feel them closing in, subtly shifting, as if the house itself had grown larger, more oppressive. I glanced around, and for a moment, I could have sworn the hallway I had just walked down had changed. The walls had narrowed, the dark shadows seemed to crawl down toward me like living things. My surroundings, had they always been like this? I couldn't be sure. I began walking, slowly, cautiously. My footsteps echoed, but the sound seemed wrong, off somehow, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house, a distorted version of reality. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the floor was pulling me deeper into its grasp. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was me. My thoughts, my perceptions, they were beginning to blur. I tried to make sense of what was happening, but every time I thought I understood, the house shifted again. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching out like a vast, endless corridor. The light, dim and flickering, cast strange, elongated shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of my vision. I stopped for a moment, trying to steady myself. I needed to focus. I had to stay in control. I took deep breaths, trying to ignore the way the house seemed to bend and twist with every passing second. But then it happened again. I turned a corner, and the hallway I had walked down moments ago had changed. It wasn't just the layout. It was the feel of the place. The walls, once cracked and decaying, were now smooth, gleaming as if untouched by time. The air was no longer stale, it was fresh, clean, almost pleasant. For a split second, I thought I had walked into another part of the house. Perhaps I had somehow missed a room, stumbled into a part of the building I hadn't seen before. But then, as I stepped forward, the change was gone. The walls were back to their decayed state, the air heavy with the same oppressive atmosphere. The change had been an illusion. The house had shifted again. A rush of cold sweat spread across my forehead. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if the house was simply driving me mad. The walls felt as if they were moving, pressing in from all sides, like they were trying to consume me. The shadows in the corners of my eyes seemed to stretch, elongating, reaching out toward me. I stumbled backward, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. My hands shook as I pressed them to my head, willing the dizziness to pass. But it didn't. The more I focused on my surroundings, the more I realized this house wasn't just old. It was something other. It wasn't just the walls and the floors that shifted. The very reality of the place bent and twisted, folding in on itself like a living, breathing thing. I tried to reassure myself, telling myself I was just imagining things. It was just the fear. I was exhausted. I had been trapped here for so long, my mind was playing tricks on me. But the longer I stayed, the more the illusion of reality shattered. My eyes darted across the hallway, searching for something, anything that would make sense, something that could anchor me to the present. But the more I looked, the more the house seemed to shift, to warp. It was like trying to catch smoke in my hands. It slipped away from me every time I thought I had a grip on it. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my racing heart. But when I opened them again, the hallway had changed. It was longer, darker. The door at the end had vanished. The walls seemed to close in around me. Was this really happening? Was I losing my mind? I pressed my hands to my temples, feeling the ache deep in my skull. I didn't know anymore. I couldn't trust my own senses. I couldn't trust the house. And worst of all, I couldn't trust myself. The whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder, like voices creeping from the walls, seeping into my thoughts. You will never leave. My breath caught in my throat. The house had me. And it wasn't letting go. I couldn't escape. Every step I took, the walls closed in tighter. Every corner I turned, I found myself back where I started, trapped in this cursed, shifting maze. My mind was unraveling with each passing moment, and it was becoming harder to tell what was real and what was a trick. And then, she appeared again. The witch. At first, it was a fleeting glimpse, just a shadow in the corner of my vision, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the same decaying house, the same warped reality. I told myself it was nothing, just the stress, the exhaustion playing tricks on me. I had to stay focused, had to keep moving forward. But then she appeared again. This time, I saw her more clearly. Her silhouette, dark and twisted, stood at the top of the staircase. Her long, ragged robes flowed around her like black smoke, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Her face was hidden in shadows, but I could feel her gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. "You think you can leave?" her voice echoed, a low, mocking whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You think you can escape? You will never leave, Evan. This house is mine." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The air was thick, suffocating. The house seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in, the shadows stretching longer and darker. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. The witch's presence was suffocating, and for the first time since I entered, I realized just how powerless I truly was. She took a step closer, her form flickering, like an image distorted by a broken mirror. She was always just out of reach, never fully solid, but her presence was undeniable. She stepped forward again, and this time I could see her face, a twisted, contorted mask of anger and malice. Her lips curled into a cruel smile as she raised her hand toward me. "Do you feel it? The fear? The doubt?" Her voice was soft, almost sweet, but it carried the weight of something far more sinister. "You think you're still in control, but you are mine now. This house is mine, and you will never escape it." I stumbled backward, my breathing ragged. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, to escape, but every direction I turned seemed to lead me right back to her, to the house. I reached for the walls, hoping they would guide me out, but they felt cold and lifeless under my touch. The air pressed against me, thick with the weight of her words, her power. And then, the house shifted again. The hallway, the staircase, everything around me twisted. The walls pulsed, the shadows grew darker, longer. The temperature dropped, a cold that seeped deep into my bones. It was as if the house was alive, responding to her presence, bending itself to her will. The air was thick with her power, and I could feel it crawling under my skin, making me question everything. I looked around, dizzy and disoriented. I was no longer sure which way was forward. I tried to move, but my legs felt weak, like I was walking through wet concrete. The more I tried to escape, the more the house seemed to mock me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. The witch was everywhere now. Every corner I turned, she was there. Her laugh echoed in the distance, her voice following me, taunting me, whispering to me in the darkness. "You will never leave. Never." Her laughter reverberated in my skull, louder, more insistent, until I thought I would go mad. I couldn't tell if she was real anymore. Was she here, standing in front of me, or was she just another illusion the house had created to drive me insane? I reached for the walls, for anything to hold on to. My fingers brushed against the wood, but it felt wrong, soft, almost liquid. I pulled my hand back, feeling a surge of panic. The walls were changing again, warping before my eyes, the familiar patterns shifting into something unrecognizable. The witch's voice came again, louder now, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from the house, from the walls, or from my own mind. "Everything you see is a lie. A trick. I control this place. and I control you. You're not escaping, Evan. Not now. Not ever. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside me now, her voice, her presence, her control. I didn't know if I could take it much longer. My mind was unraveling, piece by piece, until I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. The house itself seemed to be closing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe. The shadows crept closer, growing longer, stretching toward me like fingers reaching out to pull me into the dark. I could hear her, always. Her voice was like a thread running through my thoughts, winding itself tighter until I couldn't escape. Do you see? Do you understand now? You are mine. Forever. The fear was overwhelming. It choked the air from my lungs, twisted my thoughts into knots. I wasn't sure if I was even standing anymore. It felt like I was falling, sinking into the very heart of the house, the very heart of her power. And then, in the silence that followed her words, I understood. The witch wasn't just in the house. The witch was the house. And I was nothing more than a part of her twisted creation. There was no escape. The truth hit me all at once, like a sudden cold wave crashing over me, pulling me under. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs buckled beneath me. The walls, the hallways, the shadows, they weren't just twisted by fear or madness. They were designed. Every corner, every shifting doorway was part of an intricate trap, an illusion crafted with cruel precision to keep me in this place forever. I could feel it now, the weight of the house, not just as a physical structure, but as something more. It was alive. No, not alive, aware. The walls weren't just rotting wood and cracked plaster, they were sentient, responding to my every move, bending reality itself to disorient and confuse me. The house was a cage, and I was its prisoner. But it wasn't a normal cage. It was something far worse. It wasn't the house that had trapped me. It was the witch. I took a shaky step forward, my eyes scanning the decaying walls, the shifting shadows. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something darker, more ancient. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of dread that flooded me, something shifted in my mind. It was as if a veil had lifted, a part of me finally breaking free of the hysteria the witch had planted so deeply within me. This was a trap. The house wasn't a building, it was a prison of the mind. The more I tried to escape, the more I was drawn deeper into its labyrinth, forced to relive its horror over and over again. The witch's power, the illusions, the voices, it was all designed to make me lose my grip on reality. She wasn't just a ghost, she was the architect of this nightmare. But why? Why had she trapped me? Why had I been chosen? I pressed my hands to my temples, my mind racing. It wasn't about me. I wasn't important. I was just another lost soul, another victim of her endless torment. And once she had me, she would keep me here, twisting my mind, feeding off my fear, until there was nothing left but madness. I stumbled backward, my thoughts spiraling, trying to make sense of everything. The house had no entrance and no exit. The windows were mere illusions. I had walked through the door before, convinced that I was leaving, but now I saw the truth. The door had never led outside, it was just another part of the illusion, a mockery of escape. I had been walking in circles, trapped in the same space, never moving forward, never getting closer to freedom. I had been walking in her mind all along. I turned toward the hallway again, but this time I didn't expect to find the familiar worn floorboards or the dusty old furniture. I knew better now. Every object, every shadow, every step was part of the same trick, the same endless cycle. The house was just a manifestation of the witch's power, a cage designed to break me. I looked around, desperate for some sign of escape, some crack in the illusion. But it was all the same. The walls pressed in closer now, as if they could sense my growing realization, my resistance to their deception. The darkness seemed to stretch farther, more oppressive, the shadows twisting into figures just out of sight, mocking me with their fleeting presence. I could almost hear the witch's laughter again, distant and faint, as if it came from all directions at once. Do you see it now? Her voice echoed through the house, soft and cruel. The house is me, and I am the house. You will never leave. Not while I exist. Her words reverberated in my skull, seeping into my thoughts like poison. The walls felt closer now, almost suffocating, and I could feel the pressure building, the weight of the illusion pressing against me. I tried to fight it, tried to push against the walls, but they seemed to bend, shift, and collapse with every move. There was no escaping this place, no breaking free from her grip. I closed my eyes, my hands shaking. I needed to think, to find some way to outsmart her. There had to be a way to break free. I couldn't accept this. I wouldn't. But deep down, I knew the truth. The more I tried to escape, the more I realized how futile it all was. Every door, every window, every step forward only led me back into the heart of the house, into the witch's clutches. I had been walking in circles, chasing an illusion of freedom, while the witch had been watching me, pulling the strings, tightening the trap around me. The fear that had once crippled me began to shift. It wasn't just terror now. It was resignation, the acceptance that this was my reality. The house, the witch, the endless corridors, they were all part of a greater plan, an unbreakable loop. I looked at the walls one last time, the markings etched into the wood, the symbols I had seen earlier. They weren't just random scratches. They were warnings, instructions. The witch had designed every detail to keep me locked in place. And I had walked right into her trap. My breath came in ragged gasps as I took one final step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The house loomed over me, suffocating in its stillness, a tomb that would never let me leave. And in the distance, I heard her voice again, softer now, but no less cruel. You're mine, Evan. Forever. I closed my eyes, the weight of her words pressing against me like a shackle. There was no escape. The house was an illusion, and I was already lost. I had no choice. The more I understood the trap, the more I realized that the only way to break free was to confront the witch herself. There was no running, no hiding. The house was hers, and it would never let me go. But maybe, just maybe, if I faced her directly, if I showed her that I was no longer afraid, I could break whatever hold she had on me. The air in the house was suffocating, thick with the weight of her presence, but I was determined. I didn't know how, but I had to try. The house had twisted and turned with each passing moment, shifting its shape in response to my every move. But it wasn't the house that controlled me, it was her. She was the source of the darkness, the force that made everything around me feel like a dream, a nightmare that refused to let go. With a deep breath, I forced my legs to move. My body felt heavy, like I was wading through thick, invisible mud, but I pushed forward, every step taking me closer to the source of my torment. I reached the hallway, the one that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls flickered and warped, as if they were trying to confuse me, to pull me into a different direction. I kept my focus. I had to find her. I had to make her stop. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and I felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck, making the hairs on my skin stand on end. I knew she was near. My heart raced, each beat echoing louder in my ears, but I didn't stop. Then I saw her. She stood at the end of the hallway, her long, tattered robe swaying like a shadow in the flickering light. Her face was still obscured, but her presence was undeniable. It was like the room itself bent around her, her power twisting the air, warping reality with every movement she made. She was the house, and the house was her. You think you can defeat me? Her voice was soft, like a caress, but there was a venom behind it that sent a shiver down my spine. You cannot escape me, Evan. You never will. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she took a slow step forward. Her eyes glowed in the darkness, two piercing points of light that seemed to pierce right through me. The walls seemed to shudder in response, as if the house itself was reacting to her power. I took a step forward, my voice shaky but determined. I won't be your prisoner anymore. I'm not afraid of you. Her laugh echoed through the hallway, hollow and cruel. You should be afraid. You've already lost. As she spoke, the house seemed to groan, its walls shifting, its foundation trembling. The air thickened with her power, and the very floor beneath me seemed to move, undulating like it was alive. I stumbled, trying to keep my balance, but it felt like the entire house was conspiring against me. The ceiling warped above me, twisting into strange shapes, and the doorways seemed to close in, narrowing the hall until it was barely wide enough to breathe. You cannot fight what you cannot see, she hissed, her form flickering like a mirage. I am the house. I am the walls, the shadows, the air you breathe. There is no escape. Panic clawed at my chest. The house was tightening its grip, the walls pressing in like they were suffocating me. I looked around, trying to find some way out, but every direction led to more confusion, more distortion. The house was alive, changing shape, warping its structure, its very essence, in response to my struggle. I turned back to face her, heart pounding in my chest. Her presence was overwhelming, a darkness that seemed to wrap around my mind, suffocating every ounce of resistance I had left. You're wrong, I said, my voice shaking but firm. I'm not trapped. I'm not a part of your house. I'm not a part of you. The witch's smile stretched wide, her lips curling into a grotesque, mocking grin. Her eyes glowed brighter, and I felt the air grow colder, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. The house reacted to her words. The walls groaned, and I heard the unmistakable sound of wood cracking. It was like the entire house was alive, groaning in pain, responding to her growing anger. The very structure seemed to be coming undone, bending and warping as if the house itself was trying to resist the witch's power. You think you can defy me? She whispered, her voice now low and menacing. You're just a fool trapped in my game. You will never escape. The temperature dropped further, and I felt my breath freeze in the air. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. The house was shifting around me, its walls closing in, the hallways elongating, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I had to act. I couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear. With a cry, I lunged forward, charging toward the witch. She was still smiling, but it was a smile of victory, as if she knew I would never succeed. But this time, something was different. The house, her creation, wasn't as strong as it had been before. As I moved, the walls seemed to falter, trembling slightly, the shadows wavering. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold air, and as I touched the space where the witch stood, everything snapped. The house howled, the walls buckling and groaning, the shadows twisting and snapping like they were breaking apart. The ground beneath me seemed to shake, and the air became a whirlwind of sound and pressure. The house reacted violently to my defiance, but I didn't stop. I pressed forward, determined to reach her, to end this nightmare once and for all. The witch screamed, her figure flickering violently, like she was unraveling. Her power, once so unshakable, was beginning to waver. The walls cracked, the floors trembled, and the house seemed to scream in agony. But just as I reached her, just as I thought I could finally defeat her, the house seemed to twist in one final, desperate attempt to keep me inside. The floor cracked beneath me, and the walls closed in with crushing force, pulling me away from the witch. With one final, anguished scream, I was swallowed by the house, the darkness, and the shadows. For a fleeting moment, everything stopped. The relentless pressure of the house, the shifting walls, and the oppressive darkness faded into an eerie silence. I was no longer suffocated by the house's tightening grip. The overwhelming weight of fear that had consumed me seemed to lift, leaving me in an unsettling stillness, like I had entered a place outside of time. My breath came ragged, and for the first time since stepping into the house, I felt the clarity that had been so elusive. It was as if the house had let go of me, or perhaps I had slipped through some crack in its illusion. But the silence, the calm, was not comforting, it was suffocating in its own way, like the air was thick with the knowledge I had been avoiding. The house seemed quieter now, almost still, as if it was waiting, holding its breath. And then, the visions began. I saw flashes of the past, memories that weren't my own, but vivid and real. Images of a woman, dressed in tattered robes, walking through the same halls I had wandered. Her eyes, glowing with unnatural light, fixed on me in the depths of my mind. I saw her chanting in the dim light of the very room where I had found the strange, glowing book. I saw her weaving dark magic, the walls of the house bending and responding to her every command, the air filled with an unnatural energy. I saw her power, the fear she had harnessed, the souls she had trapped within these walls. And I understood. The house had never been just a building, it had been a prison. But not just for the living. The witch had created it to trap souls, feeding on their fear, their terror, until there was nothing left of them but shadows. The witch wasn't just a figure from the past. She was a parasite, a predator, and the house was her hunting ground. She had trapped souls here for centuries, using their fear to sustain herself, to grow stronger. Every moment of terror, every step I had taken deeper into the house, had been part of her feeding ritual. My fear had only made her more powerful. And I had walked straight into her trap, just like all the others before me. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing against my chest. The house had been alive, but not in the way I had first thought. It wasn't the walls or the floors that were alive, it was the witch, living off the souls she had trapped. It was her essence that filled every corner, every crevice, every shadow. She was the house, and the house was her. But there was more. As I delved deeper into the visions, I saw the pattern, the horrible truth of her power. The souls she had captured, people just like me, were not simply lost. They were consumed. The fear they felt was the witch's sustenance. And when the fear reached its peak, when their terror became too great, she took their essence completely, leaving nothing behind but empty husks. The realization hit me like a hammer. The house was not just a trap, it was a feast. A never-ending cycle of fear and consumption, feeding the witch and strengthening her grip on this world. Each soul she trapped added to her power, and she would continue to feed until there was no one left to trap. I looked around, the weight of the house's history settling over me like a dark fog. I was standing in the middle of a nightmare that had been going on for centuries, an endless loop of suffering and consumption. And I was its latest victim. The silence around me deepened, and the walls seemed to close in once more, the flickering shadows returning, but this time they felt different. They were no longer mere illusions. They were the souls of those who had come before me, trapped in the house, feeding the witch's endless hunger. I could feel their presence, their silent screams, as they floated just beyond my reach, lost in the endless corridors of the house. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the truth was now pressing down on me physically. The house responded, shifting again, reacting to my fear. It knew I had discovered its secret. It knew that I was beginning to understand its purpose. But it didn't matter anymore. The witch had fed on the fear of so many before me. And now, it was my turn. As I stumbled forward, the house seemed to warp around me, the shadows twisting into figures that flickered in and out of existence. But amidst the darkness, I saw the witch again. Her figure stood at the end of the hall, watching me, her glowing eyes burning with malicious intent. "You understand now," she whispered, her voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the house. "You see the truth of this place. You see what I have done and what I will continue to do. There is no escaping me. There is no escaping this house." I took a deep breath, my body trembling, but I no longer felt the same terror. The fear that had gripped me for so long was beginning to fade. The house no longer had the same hold over me, because I understood it now. I understood what I was up against. But knowing the truth didn't make escape any easier. The house was alive with her power, and even now, as I stood on the edge of the abyss, I realized that the only way to truly escape was not to run or fight. The only way to leave this nightmare was to break the cycle. But the price was high. Far higher than I was willing to pay. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls groaning and the floors creaking. The witch's power, her presence, hung in the air like a suffocating fog. There was no way out. And as I stood there, in the heart of the house, the truth echoed in my mind like a final, unanswerable question. Was I already too late? The house was alive with the witch's power, but now the silence had a weight to it, a presence that was heavier than before. I could feel her watching me, her glowing eyes piercing through the shadows. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping rapidly, and the walls groaned as if the house itself was responding to her call. And then I heard it, the whisper of her voice, so faint at first that I almost thought I had imagined it. "You're just like the others," she murmured, her voice a soft, venomous hiss. "A foolish soul who thought he could escape me." I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw her. The witch stood before me, her figure flickering in the dim light, as though the very air was warping around her. Her face, twisted and cruel, was half obscured by the shadows, but her glowing eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "You think you can break free, that you can understand this place?" she continued, her lips curling into a sinister smile. "You think you can escape your fate?" I stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in like a dagger to the heart. The truth that had been building in my mind, the truth I had tried to deny, became undeniable. She was right. I had been drawn in, just like all the others. The house had not been a mere place, it had been a trap, and I was its latest victim. My fear, my terror, had only made her stronger. "I knew you would come," she whispered, her voice suddenly growing louder, more commanding. "You thought you were special, that you could be the one to survive. but you're just another meal, another soul to feed my power. Your fear only nourishes me." Her words echoed through the house, each one a strike against my resolve. She was right. I had been so afraid, so consumed by the terror that the house created, that I had unknowingly given her everything she needed to grow stronger. The whispers, the distorted reflections, the shifting walls, all of it had been part of her plan to break me down. And I had fallen for it. The witch took a step closer, her presence overwhelming. "You were never meant to leave," she said, her smile growing wider. "I have been waiting for this moment. Your fear, your struggle, everything you've experienced, it's all been for me." I took a shaky step back, the realization of my fate sinking deeper into my chest. "No. I won't let you feed on me," I stammered, the words coming out in a desperate gasp. Her laughter rang out, filling the entire house, echoing off the walls like a dark symphony. "You already have. You always have. Every step you took, every moment you feared for your life, it fed me. Your terror is what has kept me alive for centuries. It is the key to my strength." The walls seemed to pulse in response to her words, their very structure vibrating with an energy I could feel deep in my bones. The house was alive with her power, and now it was too late to turn back. The fear I had felt, the desperation, it had only made her stronger. She had woven herself into every corner of the house, and now there was no escape. "You see," she continued, her voice like ice, "your fear wasn't just an emotion. It was a gift. A gift I've been feeding on ever since you entered this house. Every whisper, every shadow, every moment of doubt, it made me stronger. And now, you're nothing more than a part of me." I shook my head, struggling to process her words. How could it be true? How could I have been so blind, so foolish? Every fear, every panic-stricken thought had been feeding her. And now, I was her prey. "You thought you could fight me, didn't you?" she taunted, her figure moving closer, her eyes glowing brighter. "You thought you could resist, but I am the house, and the house is me. And you are nothing more than another lost soul, just like all the others." I felt the walls close in on me, the air growing thick with the weight of her presence. She was everywhere, every corner of the house pulsing with her power, every shadow a reflection of her twisted form. No, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling of helplessness. "I won't let this be my end." The witch's laughter rang out again, this time colder, more malicious. "It's too late for you. Your fear has already sealed your fate. The moment you set foot in this house, you became mine. And now, you will become part of me, just like all the others. Your soul will be trapped here, feeding my hunger forever." I stumbled backward, my legs feeling weak beneath me. The walls were closing in, the air growing colder, and I could feel her power tightening around me like a vice. I was nothing more than a victim, another piece of her never-ending cycle. But even as the witch's power pressed down on me, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let her consume me like she had with so many others. There had to be a way out, a way to fight back. But as the walls around me began to shift, and the shadows seemed to close in on all sides, I realized one horrible truth. The house was not just a prison, it was a living entity, fed by the fear of its victims, and I was the latest to be caught in its insidious web. And then, in the distance, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, faint but growing louder, and I knew I wasn't alone. It was too late. I was trapped. I tried to push the panic down, to focus, to think logically. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. The witch's presence was suffocating, and yet I couldn't let it crush me. There had to be a way out. There had to be a weakness in her power, something, anything that I could exploit to break free. I glanced around desperately. The house seemed to pulse with life, the walls shifting as though they were breathing, and the air was thick with an almost tangible fear. The witch's voice echoed in my ears, growing louder, twisting with malicious intent. You cannot fight me, Evan. I am the house. I am the fear. And you are nothing but prey. I clenched my fists, trying to block out her words. No. I couldn't let her break me. Not yet. I had to think. I had to keep moving. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, hoping to find some corner, some space that wasn't already filled with her influence. My footsteps echoed through the vast emptiness, but the sound didn't reassure me. It only seemed to amplify the weight of the house, as though the building itself was watching me. I darted into the first room I could find, a dimly lit library, filled with rows of dusty, forgotten books. Maybe there was something here. Something to explain what she was, how she was controlling me, how I could stop it. The room was oppressive, and as I stepped further in, the shadows seemed to stretch out toward me like hands, reaching for my body, pulling at my mind. I shook off the creeping dread and turned to the nearest shelf, yanking open the first book I could find. The pages were yellowed with age, the words fading into the paper. Nothing. I tried another and another, but none of them had anything that could help me. They were all filled with the same dark, cryptic text, more of the witch's power, her twisted influence, her unholy rituals. Frustration built inside me like a storm. My skin prickled, and I could feel her eyes on me, even though I didn't dare turn to look at her. I was running out of time. I was running out of options. The walls creaked again, louder this time, like the house was shifting in response to my movements. I heard her again, her voice a whisper that slithered into my mind. You can't escape me, Evan. This place is mine. Your fear makes me stronger. Every moment you waste, you feed me. I slammed the book down in frustration, the sound reverberating through the room. My heart pounded in my chest, but I refused to let it control me. I needed to find a weakness, something to break the spell she had cast on me. In the far corner of the room, I noticed something strange. A door, hidden behind a pile of old furniture, as though it had been deliberately concealed. My breath caught. Could this be it? Could there be something behind that door that would give me the answers I needed? I hurried toward it, but the moment my hand touched the doorknob, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping drastically. The house seemed to tighten around me, like a snake coiling around its prey. I hesitated, a sense of dread crawling up my spine. I didn't want to open it. I knew something terrible lay beyond it, but I had no choice. If there was even a sliver of hope, I had to take it. With a deep breath, I twisted the knob and shoved the door open. The room was different from the rest. Dark, yes, but there was something ancient about it, something that whispered of forgotten knowledge. The air was thick with dust, and at the center of the room was an altar. It looked almost like a shrine, covered in strange symbols, lit by flickering candles that gave off an otherworldly glow. Before I could step further into the room, I felt it, a sudden, overwhelming presence, the witch's power crashing into me like a tidal wave. Her voice surged inside my mind. You think you can fight me? You think you can understand what I am? You're just another lost soul, another pawn in my game. I stumbled back, a scream building in my throat, but I couldn't let it out. I couldn't give in to her. I couldn't. But even as I tried to steady myself, the room around me began to shift, the walls warping like liquid, and the altar seemed to grow taller, looming over me. No, I gasped, shaking my head. No, this can't be real. But it was real. The witch's power had already seeped into every corner of the house. Every inch of space was hers to command. And I was her source of nourishment. My attempts to fight her had only made her stronger. The house responded to my fear, my desperation, and with every ounce of terror that I felt, the witch grew more powerful. The more I resisted, the more she thrived. There was no weakness. There was no escape. Your struggle is pointless, she whispered, her voice now all around me, drowning out my thoughts. You are mine, and you will be mine forever. I backed away from the altar, my legs weak beneath me, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. It was happening again. The walls began to close in on me, the space shrinking, the air growing colder. Please, please, I begged, my voice barely a whisper. Tell me there's another way. Tell me how to stop this. But there was no answer. The house swallowed my words, as if it never heard me at all. I turned toward the door, but it had vanished, replaced by more shifting walls, more endless corridors. The witch's power had consumed the room, and now it was consuming me. Every attempt to escape, to break free, had only tightened her grip on me. I was trapped. There was no hope. There was no way out. I collapsed to my knees, defeated, as the witch's laughter filled the room. You are mine now, Evan. You always were. You were never meant to leave. And in that moment, I understood. The house wasn't just a physical prison. It was an extension of her hunger, her power. The more I struggled, the more I fed her. I had never had a chance. I had already become part of her. And now, I would never leave. I could feel the witch's presence pressing in from all sides, her power tightening around me like a vice. The house had become an oppressive, living thing, feeding off my fear, controlling every movement I made. But in the back of my mind, a small, desperate part of me clung to the idea that there might still be something, some way to understand her, to break her hold. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, my eyes caught something out of place. A small wooden desk, withered with age, its surface covered in layers of dust. On it lay an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn, as though it had been here for centuries. I hesitated. The witch's voice echoed in my ears, her whispers like poison, telling me that nothing I did would matter, that everything I touched would lead to my doom. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. With trembling hands, I reached for the journal, my fingers brushing against its surface. It was cold, colder than anything else in the room, as if the very book had been cursed. I pulled it closer, feeling the weight of it, and opened the first page. The handwriting inside was scrawled in a hurried, frenzied style, as if the writer had been desperate to get their thoughts down before someone, came for them. I couldn't make sense of the first few pages. They were filled with strange symbols, warnings, and incoherent ramblings. But then, on a page near the back, I found something different. A story. The ink was smudged in places, as though it had been written with trembling hands, but the words were clear enough. I was not always this, the entry began. Once, I was just a girl, born into a world of cruelty and hate. My family was poor, destitute, and my mother, a healer, was hunted for the gifts she possessed. The villagers called her a witch, and I, her daughter, was her only protection. But one day, they came for us. They took her from me, burned her at the stake, and left me to rot in the ashes. The words blurred as a lump formed in my throat. The witch, the one tormenting me, had once been a victim. The journal continued. Alone, I wandered the forest, cursing those who took everything from me. But the pain, the grief, was too much. I was lost, consumed by the need for revenge. And it was then that I found it. The book. The one that promised power beyond measure. I froze. The book. It had to be the same one I had seen earlier, the one in the hidden room. The one that had given her such power. At first, it was just whispers. And then, the magic, it consumed me. It twisted my mind, my heart, until I no longer cared for the world I once knew. I became something else, something darker. I used the power to summon the souls of the dead, to trap them, to feed on their fear, just as I had been fed on. I promised myself I would never be weak again. Never be helpless. I shuddered as the truth hit me. The witch had once been just like me, a victim of a cruel, unjust world. She had sought vengeance, yes, but in the end, her thirst for power had consumed her. She had become the very thing she had hated, feeding on others' fear in an endless cycle. But there was more. The journal continued, revealing the depths of her torment. Now, I haunt this place. The house is my prison, my sanctuary. And I feed on those who are foolish enough to enter. I take their fear, their pain, and make it my own. I am not the monster, I am the victim. I am the one who was wronged. And I will never let go of this power, no matter the cost. Her words echoed in my mind. She was a victim. She had been broken, twisted, just like I had felt since entering this house. Her suffering had turned into something monstrous, something that had fed off the very thing that had once tormented her, fear. But the more I read, the more I began to understand something else, something that filled me with a cold dread. The witch's cycle of vengeance had never ended. She had become trapped by her own hunger, feeding on others' fear for so long that she had forgotten what it meant to be human. She had become a part of the house itself, a prisoner to her own power. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. The witch wasn't just tormenting me for sport, she was a reflection of my own fears, my own desperation. She was the embodiment of a twisted kind of justice, but it was no longer justice. It was something darker, something that fed on the very thing she had once fought against. Now you understand, don't you? Her voice hissed in my ear, so close I could feel her breath on my skin. You see me for what I truly am, a victim of the world, just like you. But unlike you, I have the power to make them all pay. I turned sharply, my heart racing. There she was, standing in the doorway of the room, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light, her twisted smile growing wider. You see, she continued, her voice almost soft now, you are just like me. You were trapped here, just as I was. And now, your fear will feed me, just as mine fed on those who came before you. Her words were a cold reality I couldn't escape. She had been a victim once, yes, but now, she was something far worse. Something that could never stop. And as I stood there, realizing the true extent of her torment, I understood something chilling. The house, the witch, and the fear, it was a cycle. A cycle I was now a part of. And there was no way out. As the witch's figure loomed in the doorway, her words echoed in my mind like a curse. She had been a victim once, just like me. She had been broken, just like me. But now, she was something else, something monstrous. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't shake the horrible truth settling deep in my chest. I wasn't just a victim here. I wasn't just trapped by her power. I was part of something much older, something more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The house itself. It had become a creature, a living thing that thrived on suffering, on fear. It wasn't just the witch who was feeding on the terror of others, it was the house itself, feeding and growing stronger with each soul it trapped. And the cycle? It had been going on long before I arrived. Long before any of us had come here, thinking we could explore a forgotten house. I could feel it now, the weight of the house pressing in on me. The walls seemed to close tighter, the air thicker, as if every corner, every shadow was watching me. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison. A trap. And it had been feeding on people like me for centuries. Each new victim added to its strength, each new soul contributing to its insatiable hunger. I wanted to scream, to break free, but every inch of the house seemed to repel me, pulling me back. The witch's laughter filled the space around me, a soft, maddening sound that crawled beneath my skin. "You think you're different, don't you?" she said, stepping closer. "You think you can escape, that you can fight it. But you're just another soul, Evan. Another weak, foolish victim who has wandered into the same trap we all fall into." Her words were like daggers, each one striking deeper into my mind. I could feel my will weakening, my spirit breaking under the weight of her words. The house, this cursed place, had a power unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't just haunted by the past, it was alive, constantly feeding, constantly growing. And I was now a part of it. I looked around frantically, as if there might be a way out, but everything was shifting. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor creaked under my feet as if it was waiting to swallow me whole. The windows that had once been my hope of escape now stared back at me like empty, soulless eyes. There was no way out. The house had closed in, and there was no escape from its endless hunger. The witch watched me, her smile growing, as if she knew the exact moment when I would finally understand the truth. "You can't escape, Evan. You never could. We're all bound to this place, just as I was. Just as you will be. Your fear feeds this house. It feeds me. And when you're gone, someone else will take your place. The cycle never ends." I tried to back away, but the house seemed to shift around me, the floorboards groaning, the walls bending inward, and I realized with a sickening clarity that this place had no true form. It was fluid, constantly changing, always feeding on the fear of whoever entered it. And it would continue feeding, always, forever. "I was once like you," the witch's voice softened, but the malice behind it remained. "Lost. Alone. Looking for answers. But the house found me first. And now it owns me. Just as it will own you." The truth hit me with a force I couldn't comprehend. This house wasn't just some abandoned structure. It was a force of nature, born from pain, born from suffering, and it had trapped the souls of everyone who had come before me, forcing them to relive their torment over and over again. And when they finally gave into their fear, the house claimed them, just as it was claiming me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no escape. I was trapped in the same cycle as the witch, as all those who had come before me. The house had no end. It would never let go. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of the realization crushing me. The house had been here for centuries, a predator that had consumed everything in its path. And now, I was a part of it. There would be no escape for me. There was only torment, only suffering, and the worst part, I wasn't even sure I was the last one. The cycle would go on. Someone else would enter the house, thinking they were different, thinking they could escape. And they would join us, trapped, forever, feeding the house with their fear. As the witch stepped closer, I realized that I had already lost. I had walked into this house thinking I could leave, thinking I could survive. But the truth was darker, deeper than I could have ever imagined. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison. And now, I was its newest prisoner. The air in the house had grown thick, almost suffocating, as the witch's presence loomed closer. The walls seemed to close in around me, but it wasn't just the house that felt like a trap. It was her voice, her eyes, her power that pulsed in every corner. I could hear the faintest whisper of her laugh, a sound so chilling it made my skin crawl. "You're beginning to understand now, aren't you?" she said, her voice barely a breath, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You've seen the truth of this place. You've felt the cycle wrap around you, squeezing the life from your soul." I tried to take a step back, but the house refused to let me move. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was rooted to the spot, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I had no choice but to face her, this twisted, broken thing that had once been human, just like me. But then, she spoke again, her voice smooth and cold, like ice against my skin. "I'll offer you a way out," she said, her dark eyes glinting in the dim light. "But you must understand, nothing comes without a price." I felt a flicker of hope. Could there really be a way out? Could I finally escape this nightmare? She raised a hand, and the house around us seemed to pulse, alive, as if it was waiting for her next words. "I can set you free, Evan. You'll walk out of this house. You'll leave it all behind." Her smile twisted, a mixture of pity and cruel amusement. "But you must leave something behind in return. Something that has always been yours, something you will never get back." I stared at her, my mind racing. What could she want from me? I had nothing left, nothing to give. But she had been feeding on my fear, feeding on my every weakness. She was right. The house had already taken so much. "You must leave behind part of your soul," the witch continued, her voice soft, almost coaxing. "A piece of yourself, your very essence. A sacrifice to the house. And in return, you'll be free. The door will open. The house will release you, and you can walk away, as if none of this ever happened." I felt the words sink in, each one heavier than the last. Leave part of my soul? The idea was incomprehensible, impossible. But the truth of it, the cold, unfeeling reality, was undeniable. The house fed on fear, but what if it also fed on something else? What if it demanded more than just terror to escape its grip? The witch stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "Think about it, Evan. You could leave this place, go back to your life, forget all of this ever happened. You'll remember nothing. No fear, no pain, no trace of the house's grip on you." She smiled, the darkness around her thickening. "But to do that, you must give up a part of yourself. Something so precious, you'll never be the same again." I felt a sickening pull in my chest. The witch's words wrapped around my mind, clouding my thoughts. Could I really give up a part of myself? Could I sever a piece of my soul just to escape? Would it be worth it to be free again, to go back to a life that seemed so distant, so impossible now? Choose wisely, she whispered, her voice now a low, hypnotic murmur. You will never have another chance. Once you make your decision, there is no turning back. I was drowning in a sea of confusion and fear. The house, the witch, the darkness, it all pressed in on me, pulling me under. My heart raced, and every part of me screamed to leave, to run, to escape. But could I truly escape at all? If I gave up a part of myself, would I ever truly be free? I could feel the weight of my decision bearing down on me. My soul, my essence, it was all that I had left. But was it enough to sacrifice just to walk away from this hell? The witch's eyes glowed brighter as she saw my hesitation, her smile widening. You are more like me than you think, she said softly. You will make the right choice, Evan. You'll do whatever it takes to be free. Just like I did. The words stung, like a bitter truth I couldn't ignore. I was already becoming something else, something darker, something trapped in a cycle, just like her. Was this my chance to escape before it was too late? My mind raced, torn between the desperate need for freedom and the crushing fear of losing everything that made me who I was. Could I risk it? Could I give up part of myself to leave this nightmare behind? Or would I remain trapped in this endless cycle, a prisoner to the house, to the witch, to my own fear? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The choice, the final choice, was before me. And I knew, deep down, that whatever I decided, I would never be the same again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The witch's words echoed in my head, repeating like a mantra I couldn't escape. Leave part of your soul, she had said. Walk away, free from this place. But at what cost? The air in the room grew thick, pressing against my chest. I could feel the house watching me, every corner alive, as though it was waiting for me to make my choice. The oppressive silence of the place seemed to stretch out, each passing second another beat in the pulse of this cursed dwelling. The witch's eyes never left me, her smile twisted and knowing, like a predator who had cornered its prey. My thoughts raced, colliding against one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. On one hand, I wanted nothing more than to leave this place. To run, to escape, to never look back. The house had become my personal nightmare. The walls, the whispers, the shadows, they all pushed me further into madness. I could still hear the faint murmurs in my ears, the soft scratching sounds of something unseen just behind me. I could feel the weight of the house around me, a pressure that was suffocating, relentless. It was as if it had reached deep into my soul, dragging out every ounce of fear, and now it was offering me a way out. But the price was too high. Could I give up part of myself? Could I walk away from everything that made me, me? My soul, my essence, it was all I had left. What if, once I gave it away, I would never be the same again? What if the house twisted it, like it had twisted the witch, turning me into something unrecognizable? Could I survive being less than human? I glanced at the witch, her eyes glowing, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She had been a victim once. She had given into the house, just like it wanted me to. Had she realized too late what she was becoming? Or had she embraced it, the power that came from feeding the house, feeding on the fear of others? I didn't know. And the thought terrified me. The door to freedom was open, but it was shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see what lay beyond it. Would I walk out and never look back, forgetting all of this as the witch promised? Or would I leave behind a piece of myself, a part that would always haunt me? Would I become like her, a twisted, empty thing, feeding off others' suffering? I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls seemed to move with me, closing in tighter, pushing me toward the decision I dreaded making. My breath was shallow, quick, as though the air had become too thick to breathe. "Make your choice, Evan," the witch said softly, her voice almost kind. "The longer you wait, the harder it will be. The house doesn't like indecision. It will swallow you whole if you hesitate too long. You will become part of it, part of me." I clenched my fists, trying to block out her words, trying to think clearly. My mind was a storm of emotions, of doubts, of fears. The temptation to escape was powerful. I could see myself walking out of that door, feeling the cool night air on my face, the freedom of the outside world. But at what cost? I thought of my family, of the life I had left behind when I came to Salem. I thought of everything I had fought for, everything I wanted to return to. Could I risk that? Could I lose everything to this house, to the witch, just for the sake of freedom? Or would I become a part of the house, a shadow, a lost soul with no memory of who I had been? The silence stretched, thick and heavy, and I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Time seemed to stand still, and yet every second dragged on, a reminder that I had to decide soon. I could feel the pressure of the witch's gaze, the weight of the house closing in around me. I closed my eyes, taking in a slow, shaky breath. My heart ached, torn between the desire to be free and the fear of losing myself forever. What was I willing to sacrifice? What would I become if I chose freedom over my soul? The witch's voice cut through my thoughts once more, soft, coaxing. "You don't have to make this decision alone. The house is part of you now, just as it is part of me. We are bound to it. We are bound together. You don't have to fight it anymore, Evan. I can help you. I can show you how to embrace what you are becoming." Her words wrapped around me like a cold, invisible chain, pulling me deeper into the web of the house. I could feel the lure of her promise, the pull of escape, but I also felt the weight of what I would lose. If I walked through that door, would I be leaving behind everything that mattered? Or would I be losing myself completely? I opened my eyes, staring into the witch's eyes, searching for any hint of compassion, any sign that there was a way out that didn't involve sacrifice. But there was nothing. Only coldness, only darkness. She was right. The house had already claimed me. And if I wanted to escape, I would have to make the hardest decision of my life. I stood at the edge, torn between two paths. One led to freedom, but at the cost of my soul. The other led deeper into the house, deeper into madness, where I would lose myself entirely. And in that moment, I realized the hardest truth of all: there was no easy way out. The house seemed to pulse around me, the walls breathing in sync with my quickened heart. The witch's presence was suffocating now, each step she took toward me a slow, deliberate threat. Her smile was stretched wide, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was as if she could see straight through me, unraveling the fabric of my thoughts, my fears. And she knew, I knew, there was no more time. "Choose," she whispered, her voice a soft, sickening lullaby. "Remain here with me, or sacrifice yourself to be free. There is no other way, Evan. Not anymore." I could feel the weight of her words, heavy and cold. The house, the witch, the endless cycle of torment, they were all waiting for me to make the decision. I could feel it now, the house closing in, the walls shifting in response to my hesitation, as if urging me to make the choice. There was no turning back. I had already been drawn too deep into this nightmare. Her form drifted closer, the air around her thickening. Every movement she made seemed to distort the space around her, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The whispers that had haunted me, the faint scratching at the edges of my sanity, they were all coming from her now. Every step she took felt like a weight added to my soul, pulling me further down. "You've seen what happens to those who refuse to surrender, Evan," the witch said, her voice like a thread of ice that cut through the suffocating heat of the room. "You saw the ones before you, trapped, screaming, lost in the void. Those who fought until the end, until their wills were shattered." She stepped forward, and I instinctively backed away, my legs trembling under me. The house shifted with her, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The doors, the windows, they were all distant memories now, part of a world that felt unreachable, unreal. "But I can set you free," she cooed, her voice soft and coaxing. "You just have to let go. Let go of your fears, your doubts. Let go of your humanity." I could feel the house breathing around me, pulling at the edges of my consciousness. The ground beneath me seemed to warp, as if it was going to swallow me whole if I didn't choose. But the thought of giving up a piece of myself, of becoming something that wasn't human, something that was bound to the house forever, horrified me. I tried to find my voice, but it felt lost, swallowed by the pressure of her gaze. I won't give in," I whispered, my throat dry. "I won't become like you." She laughed then, a cruel, hollow sound that reverberated through the room. "You're already becoming like me, Evan. You're already part of this place. You've felt it. Haven't you? The way the house holds you, feeds on you. Your fear, your doubt, they're its nourishment. They make you weak. They make you mine." I took another step back, panic flooding my chest. Every part of me screamed to get out, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. No door. No window. Just the suffocating darkness and the witch, her grip tightening around me. "You think you have a choice, but you don't." "Not anymore," she continued, her form shifting, becoming more ethereal, more alien. "You either remain here, trapped forever, feeding the house with your terror, or you sacrifice yourself. A piece of your soul, a piece of who you are. You'll leave, free from the house, free from me, but you'll never be the same again." I could feel the house tightening its grip around me. It was closing in, the air thick with the scent of decay, the walls pressing in with a slow, relentless inevitability. The witch was right. I had been trapped from the moment I stepped inside. My fear, my uncertainty, they had already bound me to this place. The longer I stayed, the more the house claimed me. I can't," I choked out. The words barely made it past my lips. "I won't become like you." But deep down, I felt the truth. I was already slipping into that darkness. I could feel it in the way my heart raced, the way my body trembled, as though I were on the verge of breaking. My fear, my doubt, my inability to choose, they were only feeding the house, feeding the witch. I was becoming part of the very thing I feared. Her smile widened, stretching unnaturally across her face. "You don't have to be afraid, Evan. Embrace it. You will be free. But at a cost. A piece of your soul will remain here, with me, forever. The house will be satisfied. And you." She stepped forward, her form shifting, becoming less human with each movement, her face now a blur of darkness and smoke. "You'll walk out of this place, but you won't be the same. You'll be empty, a shell. You'll remember nothing, feel nothing. But you will be free." I felt my breath catch, my throat closing. Could I live with that? Could I walk away from everything I was, everything I had been? A part of me, the last shred of my humanity, would remain trapped here. But I would be free. I would walk out of this house, never to return. The choice was unbearable, and I could feel the weight of it crushing me. Escape, but at what cost? Sacrifice everything I had left to leave this nightmare behind? The witch's laughter echoed in the dark, and for a moment I thought I might collapse under the pressure. But in the depths of my fear, I knew what I had to do. There was no way out of this place without losing something. The house had already taken so much from me, and now it was asking for the final piece. I swallowed hard, staring at the witch. I'll do it, I whispered, my voice breaking. I'll sacrifice it. I'll give it to you. Her smile was victorious, cold, and hungry. Good. You've made the right choice. And as she closed in, her figure blending with the shadows, I knew that I would never be the same again. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in front of the witch, his mind racing. He had spent what felt like a lifetime in this house, learning its secrets, feeling its weight pressed down on him, and understanding its cruel nature. The knowledge from the journal still burned in his mind, fragments of the witch's past, the twisted history of the house. He could feel the presence of the house itself, the way it seemed to pulse, alive and aware of his every movement. The witch's smile twisted into something more sinister as she stepped closer, her form flickering in and out of focus, as though the house itself couldn't even fully hold onto her. You think you can defeat me, Evan? You've seen what happens when people fight. They become part of this place, part of me. Evan stood firm, though every part of him screamed to run, to give in. But this time, he was determined. He had learned enough. The journal had shown him the witch's weakness, the way her power was tied to the house, to the souls she had trapped and fed on. She wasn't invincible. Not anymore. I'm not going to let you win, Evan said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. I know how you were trapped here. How you feed off of us, how you use our fear to survive. But I won't let that happen to me. The witch's eyes narrowed, and the air grew colder. Her power, once all-consuming, seemed to flicker for a moment, just a moment of vulnerability. Evan seized it. He raised the book, the one that had first caught his attention, glowing faintly in the room filled with potions and forgotten spells. The knowledge inside it had been his salvation, a way to confront her, to use her own magic against her. You can trap us, feed off us, but there's something you didn't account for, Evan said, his voice more confident now, the words coming faster as he felt the power of the house and the witch begin to falter. I've seen what you really are, a victim. A prisoner just like us. The witch snarled, the room seeming to twist with her fury. Shadows swirled around her, thick and heavy, but Evan held the book tighter, his fingers trembling as he traced the words written on its pages. The ancient language was a mystery to him, but the symbols, the chants, they seemed to make sense now, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The witch screeched, her form distorting, her human shape collapsing into something darker, more grotesque. You think you can defeat me with words, with old rituals? Her voice sounded less human now, a guttural growl. I am the house. I am its soul. I am your fear. Evan didn't hesitate. He began to chant, the words flowing from his lips, ancient and unfamiliar, but somehow powerful. The walls of the house groaned, the floor beneath him creaked, as though the very foundations of the building were reacting to the ritual. The witch screamed, her figure distorting further, as though the house itself was rejecting her, fighting her presence. "No," she howled. "You can't do this. You're just a boy. You can't undo what has been done." Evan pushed forward, his voice growing louder, stronger, driven by a surge of determination. The house seemed to resist, its walls shaking, its floors trembling. The shadows that had once been thick and oppressive were now fading, retreating into the corners. The witch's form flickered, her face changing, becoming less distinct, less powerful with every word he spoke. The house began to shake violently, as if it was coming alive in response to the ritual. The walls cracked, splintering with the weight of years of suffering, as the witch's screams filled the air, her power crumbling. "Be gone!" Evan shouted, summoning every ounce of strength, every bit of willpower. The air seemed to crackle with energy as the witch's form twisted and writhed, her power fading, her hold on the house weakening. The very foundations of the cursed building seemed to shudder in protest. With a final, bone-chilling scream, the witch's form dissolved into the shadows, her presence fading from the house entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on Evan, the constant whispers, the fear, they were all gone. The house, once alive with dread, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Evan stood there, exhausted, the book still clutched in his hands. The floor beneath him seemed solid again, and the walls, though aged and decaying, no longer seemed alive, no longer seemed to move with the weight of evil. For the first time, the house felt still, as though the presence that had haunted it for so long was gone. But as Evan took a slow, steady breath, he knew that the battle had come at a great cost. The house, though silent now, still held its memories. And the witch's influence, though diminished, was not entirely gone. He had defeated her, yes. But the price of that victory had been steep. The house was still a prison for the souls it had claimed, and he could feel that, deep within his bones. The question remained, could he truly escape without carrying the burden of what he had learned? Would he ever be free, or would he too become part of the house's dark history? The silence around him felt heavy, but in that moment, Evan knew one thing for certain: he had broken the cycle. The witch was gone. The house was no longer alive with her power. And now, at last, it was time to leave. As the last of the witch's power dissipated into the ether, Evan stood amidst the crumbling ruins of the house, the echoes of the battle still ringing in his ears. The silence was deafening, almost unnatural. The oppressive air had lifted, and yet something felt off. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel free. The walls groaned ominously, as if protesting the sudden calm. Evan's heart skipped a beat. The ground beneath his feet trembled, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the depths of the house itself. The house, which had seemed still moments ago, now felt alive once again, but in a different way. A darker, more final way. No, this can't be, Evan muttered to himself, stepping backward, his hand still clutching the book. His mind raced, a sudden panic rising in his chest. The house was shaking, as though it were alive and convulsing in its death throes. The ceiling cracked, sending dust and chunks of plaster raining down on him. The floorboards splintered, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The house wasn't just settling, it was disintegrating, collapsing on itself. Evan's pulse quickened. He turned and tried to run toward the front door, the exit that had once been his only hope, but as he ran, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The door, which had once been open to him, was now an impossible distance away, swallowed by the shadows that seemed to stretch infinitely. No matter how fast he ran, it remained just out of reach. His breaths grew ragged, his legs heavy as the weight of the house's decay pressed against him, suffocating him. His mind raced with the terrifying realization the house wasn't collapsing out of defeat, it was closing itself off, trapping him inside. The walls groaned louder now, as though they were speaking to him, mocking him, warning him. Evan stumbled, looking around for a way out, but there was none. The windows were shattering one by one, the glass falling like a storm of sharp shards to the floor. The entire house seemed to be imploding, folding in on itself in slow, deliberate motion. The witch's taunts echoed in his mind. You think you can leave? You think you can escape this place? You belong to it now. And the horrible truth began to sink in. Evan had never truly been able to escape. The house, the witch, it had always been part of him. The torment, the fear, the power, it had become his. His soul, his fear, had been tied to this place the moment he stepped inside. There had never been any escape. With a final, thunderous crack, the floor buckled beneath him, and Evan fell into the dark depths of the house, swallowed by the very thing he had fought to defeat. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the crumbling walls, but there was nothing to hold on to. The weight of the house was too much. As the house continued to collapse, Evan's last thought was a chilling one. The house had never been meant to let anyone go. The ground beneath him gave way, and everything went black. The house's destruction was final, its walls caving in, its foundation crumbling into the earth. There would be no trace of it left, no sign that it had ever existed, save for the faint whispers carried on the wind. Whispers that might one day draw another soul to the heart of Salem, where the house, its curse, its power, would begin anew. And the cycle would continue. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.